Okay, folks, we are live. So for those listening at home, welcome to the Dungeon Musings YouTube channel. My name is Kevin Madison, and I'll be your friendly Dungeon Muser this evening, or this afternoon, or this morning, wherever this finds you, whenever this finds you. Today, it is, at the time of recording, December 26th. So it's Boxing Day in some parts of North America and Europe. Oh, let me make sure our stream is actually going live here. It is. And I thought what I would do, I'm going to be recording a end of year video on New Year's Day to look back at the year that was 2023. Over the course of 2023, we ran, by the time that video, or by the time the year ends, we'll have run 32 different games over the course of the year. And I got thinking over the holidays that there are a number of games that I just don't get to the table. Early in the history of this channel, I had done reviews on games as well, but I was really loath to review games that that I haven't got to the table. So I kind of got away from that. Also, it's a niche that's covered by so many other people anyway that, like, my extra 2 cents doesn't matter. I figured it would be better to show my affection for certain games by just running them. But I got thinking over the holidays, and there's a handful of games that really, I think, would otherwise make for really terrific ongoing campaigns. This is in part due to my recent, recent celebration of the 200th session of our Night Below campaign. At the time of recording, our ongoing Night Below campaign that has altered between a bunch of different D&D style games over the course of its 5-year history has changed a number of, has got me thinking about what made that successful, and I guess the other thing is, at the time of recording, we have a number of other games that are celebrating 1 year or longer anniversaries too, including not the least of which our Spires of Paradar campaign, which is going into, I think, its 3rd year now. It got me thinking about what other games, that I have that I really love, and I think that would fit for an ongoing campaign, but I just don't get to the table, and I don't have plans to get to the table either. There's only so much room on the, at the table, unfortunately. But these are all really games or supplements for games that I really, really love, and I thought it'd be fun to talk about them. Put on my best Christmas sweater, and, well, not my best. This is a Christmas sweater my mom made me, and it is, unlike the other Christmas sweater that you may have seen over the holidays, it is not spray-on plastic on top of a sweatshirt, so it's going to be having more breathing to it. I'm going to check chat as we go along as well, so if there are any questions or comments about any of the games that I'm covering, then please feel free to do so. I did not really announce this, so there may not be anyone in chat, but that is okay. The way I'm going to talk about these games as well is in terms to give some structure to this. I thought I would talk about the setting. So what about the setting appeals to me, the suitability of the game itself and the setting itself for an ongoing campaign, and the sensibilities. So what are the game mechanics? What would be the play experience at the table? Many of these are based on games that I already have run before, or are just ones that I've owned for a long time or thought about for a long time. So that is the plan. I have an order to this as well, so I hope to get through these in some semblance of order. I'm going to take some breaks for coffee throughout it because it is Boxing Day and I'm still a little fuzzy from the holidays. So without any further ado, let's get to our first game. So I'm going to set up that there. Our first game is Steadlands. Now, let me grab, I have many visual aids, but I thought I'd make it easier for the folks following at home or who may want to be scanning through the video to just see the little icons as well. So for each of these games, I have a description, or I have a little image to go with when I'm talking about that game. In addition, there is a link in the description of this video to either the publishers or the printers for all of the games that I'm going to be talking about, with one exception. One of the games is out of print and you cannot get it in any format other than the secondary market. Because of that, I have included a link to the category for that game from our friends at Noble Knight Games. Noble Knight Games Games, as regular viewers may be aware, is the preeminent unionized retailer of hard-to-find and out-of-print RPGs in North America. So it's a great source of getting any copies of that game at a reasonable price as well, too. I got a number of copies when I was into that game. So with that said, let's dive into this. So the version of Deadlands I'm going to talk about is the one based on the Savage Worlds Adventure Edition. Savage Worlds Adventure Edition is a game we have been running on the channel, and it has we've actually been running it for a number of years now for different purposes, and it's a game that I have really enjoyed getting to know. And by getting to know, I mean more than just learning the rules. There is a feel at the table when you're playing Savage Worlds that is really unlike any other game I've run. There are a handful of games that are like that, where just the play experience is so different, and what you get out of it feels so different than what any other, or what other games bring to the table. Savage Worlds, I misunderstood it as a multi-universal or generic role-playing game for a long time. And that's not really what Savage Worlds is. Savage Worlds is an emulation, in my mind, I should say. So I'll preface it with that. In my mind, it is capturing a feel of a story. It is a pulpy action story, and it gives you some terrific game mechanics and some terrific kind of optional rules or subsystems that you can use to simulate that kind of pulpy action experience. Deadlands was the first of the games that was published by Pinnacle Entertainment way back in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s. I think it's the early 90s is when it first came out, but this is in the history of Deadlands. Deadlands has been through several editions, at least 2 of which have been with the Savage Worlds rules. The Savage Worlds rules were actually built out of a board game that was produced by them at the Great Rail Wars, and it was a streamlined version of the Deadlands system, which then gave birth to the first iteration of Savage Worlds, which then saw a bunch of iterations, and with each iteration of Savage Worlds, they've added on new content. And in addition to what's added on in Savage Worlds, Deadlands has likewise done that. There are different studios, there are different publishers who definitely publish different editions of the games, but I'm hard-pressed to think of many that have the same creators in it. So Savage Worlds, in a way, is a really fascinating game line to explore, if for no other reason, because you're seeing the creators collaborate with other people, learn lessons from other games, and incorporate them into their games. This, in my mind, is no more evident than in their Superpowers Companion, which we use to run the Guard campaign that we run at alternating Saturdays. And I really love Savage Worlds. Like it's a really, really fun system. It's not the game I would necessarily want to be running all the time, but for an ongoing campaign, it's a really, really great system, particularly if you adopt ways of slowing down the different advancement systems. The range for your character is fairly narrow in Savage Worlds. You've got about 20 steps, but those steps are a lot smaller than what they are in, say, like a class-based or a level-based class system like Dungeons & Dragons or any of the games that are iterated from that. However, what we've done in Savage Worlds, in our Savage Guard campaign, is I just slow down advancement. I have it takes one session for the first tier, and then it takes 4 sessions for each of them, and then we go up, so it'll be a longer gap between advancements. But there are other things that happen in the game and other mechanics you can reward that allow you to expand, to give the players a sense of achievement and a reward for successfully doing things beyond just the here's your next level kind of stuff. So all of that is what got me thinking about Deadlands. Now, Deadlands, in the current version, at the time of recording, we're waiting for one more book to come out in print, but there is the setting book. Each of these were kickstarted or not kickstarted, but crowdfunded through Pinnacle's in-house kind of Kickstarter program, which I can't remember the name of. There's the Weird West Companion and the Guide to the Weird West. The new adventure coming out is called Night Train, and I don't know whether there is any additional information that is coming with that or any additional setting info. I imagine there is. What I do know is at the time of recording, Deadlands, just to give you an idea of how expansive the character types are in this. If you're not, I guess first off, if you're not familiar with Deadlands, Deadlands is a Weird West setting. Maybe one of the first ones for Boot Hill had some stuff that you could either in the Boot Hill itself or in one of the Dragon articles that added in like weird stuff to the Old West. But Deadlands is one of the first very successful Weird West settings. Deadlands is set in a world where the Civil War never ended. The Civil War kind of petered out because the dead started rising, I think at Gettysburg, maybe? I really don't know. My knowledge of American Civil War timeline went on is very spotty. And Savage Worlds is one of those games where I never really... I don't really care so much to read. I mean, this is true of most settings, to be honest, but I don't really care to read a whole bunch about the setting. I want to know enough so I can start running games in whatever the setting is. And Deadlands is a really cool one where the reason the dead were coming back and the reason that Supernatural really started coming back to the land is because of this corrupted First Nations shaman who, from an antediluvian evil, gets corrupted and convinced to release some of these things. So there's evil about in the land, and the broad strokes of what you're doing in Deadlands is you are playing heroes who in theory are going around facing these evils, defeating them, and then trying to bring down the level of threat in the land. One of the things that is part of the setting is that there are fear levels. So different places you'll go, depending on how influenced by the Reckoners. The Reckoners are the big bad in the setting. They've influenced these different places, and the fear levels will affect not only fear checks or how terrifying creatures are, but may also affect power levels of certain things as well. Certain creatures will be more powerful when they've got a higher fear level that they're in. But what you can do, and this has always been part of the setting, is your characters who are muckrakers or newspapermen or whatnot, they can go, or preachers, they can go back to town and they can print their stories and they can tell the tales and they can get up on the pulpit and spread the good word, as it were, that these creatures can be faced and defeated, which brings down the fear level in the region, thereby weakening the influence of the Reckoners. Those familiar with the setting will know that whether they were successful ultimately, those good heroes were successful, is a different question. But the thing that appeals to me about it, especially where the game is now, you have with just the archetypes. So if you were to just grab the archetype bundle and pick a character and start playing in the Weird West, you would have 42 archetypes to pick from. At present, there are 42 different individual character ideas that are all signature to the Deadlands setting that are ready to pick up and play. The setting book, the Hell on Earth, offers a ton of extra information about it, but the nice thing with all the Savage Worlds products is they offer a bunch of robust tools for you to generate your own stuff. So random encounters or plot ideas or whatnot. And even if you don't like that stuff or don't like incorporating that into your own campaign, it's a ton of fun to just review and get ideas from. So even if you are the type of, in this case, a marshal who likes to plan ahead, have everything kind of scheduled out, you can do all that prep work ahead of time. You can make rolls and take what you want, discard what you would like. It just gives you ways of thinking outside of what you would normally apply. So the tools in the game for the marshal is really great. So I've already started abandoning my format that I set up for this. So the setting in this is an Old West or the Weird West, I should say, not the Old West, where heroes are facing up against the forces of the Reckoners, whether direct, not everyone, is part of this Reckoners conspiracy. There are some dark, evil things that don't realize what the greater influence is. And they're just nasty, whether human or non-human or whatever. The setting itself captures a lot of that, a lot of the stuff that you would think of as classic Dungeons and Dragons type play, where there are remote settlements, they're bedeviled by monsters, they need heroes to help them. It takes all those kind of ideas but puts it through a fun Weird West lens. to the point where magic is a thing you can you can do. Before the Reckoners returned, there was this book called Hoyle's Book of Tricks that was passed around. That was card. It was for the lay people reading it. It would be a card, card games. But for those initiated in the occult, they can realize it's actually ways of working magic. And there are steampunk things. There's heroes risen from the dead. It is a absolutely wild and exciting and varied setting. Tons of unique monsters as well. The Tumblebleed, a creature that appears to be a tumbleweed, but actually is think of like hungry barbed wire that can roll. It's amazing stuff. There's also underground worms, and regular viewers of the channel will know my adoration for the film Tremors. There is something very similar to that called the Mojave Rattler that has a fantastic Lovecraftian backstory to it. So as far as the setting is concerned, that's what the setting obviously is something that would appeal to me. There is a big bad. There's fun, short-term adventures you could involve yourself with, but a larger plot that also is looming over everything. The suitability for long-term campaigns, as I said, in past, I have thought of Savage Worlds as, it's suitable only for short-term campaigns. I have abandoned that idea now. I think that with a slowed advancement, you're not starving the players of opportunities to do cool things or find interesting things or make new interesting choices with their characters, particularly if you play with Conviction. Conviction is an optional optional rules mechanic that if your characters spend their conviction, they get to roll an extra d6. I should say, if you're not familiar with Savage Worlds, the dice explode in this game, which is really awesome, and it uses cards for initiative. And there are few times in any other game that match the excitement in the game when one player draws a joker, which allows them to act whenever they want, and all of the other players, including the one who drew the joker, get narrative meta currency. And if the players are on the back footing and they're starved for those narrative meta currencies and they need a turn of events, seeing a joker hit the table when it's needed is amazing in Savage Worlds. It's really unmatched in any other game because everybody benefits from it. So that's as far as suitability, I'm not concerned about long-term long-term advancement. This game has legs is another way of putting it. And the sensibilities, this is just a personal thing, and it has all the sensibilities I love from role-playing games. Wild character ideas that still can be very grounded and deeply personal, because in Savage Worlds you pick hindrances for your characters, and the hindrances are basically excuses for fun things to happen in the story. It's also rare that you only have a handful of them, so it's not like games where like GURPS or Hero System, where you're picking a ton of different disadvantages and you're overwhelmed with them just to get the points to build your character. In this case, you're going to have 3, maybe 4 at most, and they're extremely thematic. Like, they feel really appropriate. You can develop other ones over the course of play, as we've learned in our Guard campaign recently. You can develop a phobia if you really screw up a fear check, but yeah, it's just as far as the sensibilities, I love Old West stuff. I love doing Southern US accents, so that's a lot of fun. There's so many fun tropes you can steal from other systems or other settings and other sensibilities. I mean, the Good, Bad, and the Ugly, not the Good, Bad, and the Ugly, Fistful of Dollars. Fistful of Dollars is Yojimbo, is taking the plot of a samurai thing. The Magnificent Seven is stealing the idea from Seven Samurai. So there are different things, the ideas from samurai, kind of stories, and to be honest, knightly or stories too. The idea of the code of the West fits kind of like a chivalric code in a way. And when you add in all the magical stuff, it's a game that would make for just a fantastic ongoing campaign. It's a great, done in one, but as players start putting down roots, in particular, as players start seeing time pass and having to, develop connections with NPCs, the way that happens in long-term campaigns, and the way that the Reckoners might come back against those things that they value, that would make for an amazing campaign. So Deadlands is, definitely a campaign that would have been fantastic. Next up, staying in the Savage Worlds vein, Savage Rifts. Now, oh boy. Oh, hey. All right, so at the time of recording, there are currently 9 print books out for it, and there are 2 more that are being released in early 2024. If you're not familiar with Rifts is the game and setting that was originally released by Palladium Books back in, I believe, the late 80s. And I'm going from my own personal memories of when this came out. Rifts is a kitchen sink setting in the sense that it has a bunch of stuff from a bunch of different games that Palladium had published by that point, but it is also very uniquely its own thing. There are a ton of elements that are included in it that are very unique to any other, are distinct from any other post-apocalyptic setting. Examples of this you can see on the screen here. For one, it's a magical setting. So magic, the apocalypse that brought about the creation of Rift's Earth comes from what was, I believe, originally a fairly limited nuclear exchange that resulted in the flooding of ley energy, magical energy, into the ley lines on Rift's Earth, which led to the eruption of these rifts, which led to more deaths. Rifts are gaps or holes or tears in the space-time fabric, and they are incredibly dangerous and incredibly violent and very unpredictable as to where they go or what they release. So more people kept dying, and then the Earth started also shifting as a result of this stuff. So you've got natural disasters added to the unnatural disasters of nuclear Armageddon and magical apocalypse. And then terrible things started coming through the rifts. What, in an older time, people might refer to as demons. In the modern sensibilities, you might think of as aliens, or perhaps both. So you fast forward about 300 years since that time, and you find yourself in the setting of Rifts. Rifts, like I said, has some of the, it's a post-apocalyptic. I think that one thing that the Savage Rifts version of the game does really well is it identifies it as a post-apocalypse. Because it's not like Mad Max, like in the immediate aftermath, where you're trying to scramble around and recover, and there can be an element of that, but the world has started to recover. There are communities again. There are widespread geopolitical units that have set up, both human and non-human, and there is a recognizable map you can kind of look at and know where things are. So it has some of the things that are characteristic of post-apocalyptic settings, like, there's like techno-barbarians, and there's repurposed technology, and there's people searching for, stuff in the ruins of old Earth. There are mutant animals, there are robots, there are aliens. So there's all the kind of fun stuff you get from that, but there's also, you'll see in the middle of this, there's that giant robot with a great big cannon. That is what's called a glitter boy, one of the signature power armored things. Rifts, the publisher, I should say, Palladium, was the first publisher of a Robotech role-playing game. There's been 2 since then. At least 2 other publishers other than Palladium, including a Savage Worlds one for that matter. But they're very big into anime, it's particularly giant robot anime. And as a result, there are some strong robot, giant power suit, giant robot armor kind of stuff in the game. You can also play a dragon. The types of characters you can play in Rifts run the gamut from biochemically augmented super soldiers to cyborgs to mutant dogs to sorcerers or psychics or dragons or robot pilots or wilderness scouts or rogue scholars, or it's just a huge variety. I didn't do a tally of the different archetypes that were available for Rifts, largely because you really can't keep track of them. Or I would have difficulty keeping track of them, and it isn't a fair reflection because there's so many character options in it. The original 3 books that were released for Savage Rifts and then re-released after the Adventure Edition came out as Adventure Edition are these 3. There's the Tomorrow Legion Player's Guide, the Game Master's Guide, or Savage Foes, and the Game Master's Guide. This version of Savage Worlds even with just these 3 books, incorporates some of the best ideas about Savage Worlds. It does a really good job of modeling, for one, the source material in a way that and this is all personal preference, I feel is superior to the original. I really love the Rift setting. I have since I was a kid, since my buddy Brent got the core rulebook for it. And but it is hampered by a very particular rule set. I'll say there are folks I know who really love the Palladium rule set, so to each their own. For my own sensibilities, this is, I think, a better implementation of it. Better is not a right way of saying it. I prefer it. They incorporate this idea called mega damage that was part of starting in Robotech, actually, with Palladium. The idea that there were some things that were so tough that unless you were capable of inflicting mega damage, you had no way of affecting it. In this setting, there already was a set of rules for something called heavy armor, so that was very easy where it's a similar thing. A handgun against a Abrams tank is not going to do anything, and absent there being some of the kind of supernatural or superhuman influence. So that gives you the rules underpinning to create such a wild world. And by the time they did Savage Rifts, Savage Worlds had really nailed down a lot of the other elements that were kind of shaky in the early years of their publication history, including superpowers, how to handle really powerful adversaries. There's also so the first 3 books were those 3 I showed you. It then expanded out, so there's Arcana and Mysticism, Blood and Banes, Empires of Humanity. This was the second Kickstarter. And then there's the Tomorrow Legion Field Manual, which is one of my absolute favorite Savage Worlds products. Because people have asked about this before. So the Tomorrow Legion Field Manual has a set of rules for overland travel. They haven't been reintroduced in any other Savage Worlds product at the time of recording, but they're so fucking fun. It's very similar to the if you've seen on our channel, we've been using the Uncharted Journey set of rules for 5th edition. Those were based on the One Ring travel rules, which were adapted to 5th edition for Adventures in Middle-earth, and then it became Uncharted Journeys when the publisher Cubicle 7 lost the rights to publish Lord of the Rings stuff. It's similar to that, but it's emblematic of the very best thing that Pinnacle does with their books, which is take an idea and then riff on it and make it more Savage Worlds-y. We have had an enormous amount of fun with those rules, not only in Rifts, but I used it in a Iron Gods game I ran, and I would probably use it in any fantasy game I ran, because it's just, it gives a fun and unpredictable aspect. It gives flavor to travel that is not just causing problems, but also giving players an opportunity to really shine in certain scenes. And it gives, some fun gameable ways of managing resources like ammunition and fuel and food and water without you having to track it in a specific way. There's dice you get, which players or game masters familiar with Forbidden Lands will be very familiar with. Again, taking ideas from other games and incorporating it. The most recent print release, at least, is Atlantis and the Demon Seas, and then there's a new one coming out it's covering South America, and I believe there's a mega adventure that's coming with it as well, appropriate for the megaversal setting of Rifts. So as far as the setting is concerned, that's the setting. It is a kitchen sink setting, but it's not kitchen sink in the sense that it is unintelligible. There are, at the time Rifts was out, there were some other games that came out. World of Cinnabar is a classic example of this, where it tries to throw everything in. Torg is another one as well. I'm not familiar enough with Torg, but I have folks whose opinion I trust who really love it or have worked on it. So, I trust that game is really good as well in its implementation of a multiversal idea. But Rifts gives you a post-apocalypse that is so unique and different And you certainly could, like, one of the things that was always a kind of a way that we thought of rifts as kids was like, oh, we can take characters from anywhere and drop them into rifts because anything could fall through the rifts. And that is absolutely true. You could do that. Nothing stops you from doing that. Although nothing stops you from doing that in any fucking game. So, you know, they're all pretend anyway. So, like, what makes the difference? It's that old Alan Moore comment about Superman. This is a pretend story. Aren't they all? So, but in Rifts, I think the way that I would want to lean into it is the elements of the setting themselves, you know, because there's so many cool things and ways to play up that setting. So the setting is incredibly diverse. There's a bunch of different types of stories you could tell in Rifts. And one thing that they do in the Savage Rifts is they give you a framework, as they do in all of their settings. As an aside, one of the very smart things that I ignored for a long time with Savage Worlds is that they always give you context for what your story is going to be about. And every one of their settings gives you a clear idea of, like, this is what your characters will do here. And being the perennial iconoclast, I always want to be like, no, I can make up my own stuff for this. And it's only in the recent years I've come to realize, like, why these are such good ideas for how to set up your campaign and then just to give an excuse to get everyone together. And in Savage Rifts, it is the Tomorrow Legion. Basically a group of different kind of good aligned allies getting together to try and, you know, make a better world. And there's plenty of really nasty things, including a not inspired by the Nazis in the sense of like Star Wars, where, you know, the Empire is kind of a hidden Nazis. In the setting, the Coalition, which is like one of the big bads in North America, the Coalition is expressly inspired by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. So, you know, and with having said that, maybe this video is going to be demonetized now, but I don't really care. This is the Rift setting gives you tons of great, like, human adversaries and supernatural adversaries, amazing ideas for characters. So the setting itself is amazing. Suitability, just like the other Savage Worlds stuff, it likewise, you know, your characters will advance and whatnot, but you can pace that out to give your campaign long legs. And one thing that I do like about this too is characters tend to expand out rather than up in Savage Worlds. That's not 100% true, because in a sense, like, you can keep raising your attributes and your skills, and your, you know, certain powers will be more effective the better you are with them. But it, you know, because Savage Worlds has a concept of the fumble. If you roll 2 ones, anytime you're doing task resolution in any Savage Worlds game, you're rolling it as a wild character, a wild card. You are rolling a d6 and you're rolling a dice equal to whatever your relevant skill or ability is. You roll both of those, and then you take the higher of the two. If you roll the maximum number that your dice can roll, you get to roll it again and add it to it. However, if you roll 2 ones, snake eyes, that is a fumble. And while you do have a lot of narrative meta currency, a fumble is always a fumble, and you cannot re-roll that using one of the narrative meta currencies, Bennies. Bennies is the other one in addition to Conviction. So what that means is that it doesn't really matter how trained you are, how superpowered or whatever else, there still is always that risk. You know, there's always that chance that things might not go your way. And while if you sat down and rolled dice, like, there's a way of saying, well, that doesn't make sense. Like, really highly trained people rarely fail. And I would agree with you on that. But that's not when you're rolling dice. You're rolling dice when the chips are down, when it really matters whether it's a success or fail. And having those dramatic turns of luck is very appropriate for, again, the feel that Savage Worlds is going for. Pulpy action. You know, how could I have forgotten that thing? Or how could I have made that mistake? Or how could I have shot so-and-so? You know, that's the stuff that makes for really fun stories. And yeah, so as far as the power level, I don't see that as being an issue for the suitability for long-term play either. The threats you face in the game are commensurate with the power level of your characters. You're facing elder gods, you're facing nations full of vampires, you're facing an entire risen Atlantis full of unnatural threats. You're facing post-apocalyptic Nazis who want to exterminate anything non-human. There's just an enormous amount of places to go to adequately challenge these characters. And as with the Deadlands setting too, presumably these characters are building towards something. So you would see them trying to start caring about their settings. And once they start caring about the things in the setting, the communities they build and whatnot, then they have something to lose. So it's something that adds more, I don't know, it adds more stakes to the game beyond just, power level. Now the bigger monster comes out. And as far as sensibilities, as is likely evident, I love this stuff. I've tried running Savage Rifts 2 or 3 years, about 3 years ago, I think. And at the time, I was not familiar enough with Savage Worlds. I struggled with a couple aspects of the system, not the least of which was setting difficulties for characters. But now that I have a much better idea of what to expect from the game and how to improvise things more easily, I think that I would be adequately prepared to handle the complexity that comes with Rifts, because there's a lot going on in it. And I also think that the folks I get to play with would likewise enjoy this stuff. Like the power fantasy for some of our players is a big part of the reason they play. And one player in particular has routinely gone back to a Rift session that we played as being one of their favorites, partly because of the power level and the scope with this. So that's Savage Rifts. Another, and just like Deadlands, I should say, there's also all these great random mission generators spread across the different books as well. So there's and that's setting aside the pre-written adventures. There's a couple of adventures that have come out so far, and then there's this mega campaign that's coming out. So there's tons of great stuff that would come for that. A really terrific game. Oh. Next up, we are going to Vampire Dark Ages. So this one is the 20th anniversary edition of this game, which makes me feel very old because I remember picking up the original Vampire Dark Ages when it came out in 1990. I want to say 94 or 5. I remember because after I bought it, the girl I was dating at the time thought it was very cool and wanted to borrow the book, and I didn't get it back for like a week. So it was poor judgment on my part. But the Vampire Dark Ages, for myself, so I guess first off, if you're not familiar with it, it was the first of the like alternate era setting books that were released alongside the original line of World of Darkness games. At the time this came out, I don't know if Changeling was out yet. I think Wraith was out. For those who aren't familiar with the Storyteller games, the original Storyteller systems, they were Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, Mage the Ascension, which I've talked about quite a bit in the channel because I love that game, Wraith the Oblivion, and Changeling the Dreaming. And then there were some other subsequent games that came out afterwards. But Vampire the Dark Ages, whenever it came out, was the first one that was set in a different time. And they released subsequently Werewolf the Wild West, which was pretty fucking cool. Not the least of which was it had a bullet hole that went through the entire book, which was super fucking cool. The game was subsequently re-released. They released a bunch of supplements for it, as was the custom of the time in the 90s. And then they released a second one called Dark Ages Vampire, which launched an entire Storyteller Dark Ages line, which included source books for Dark Ages Werewolf, Dark Ages Mage, Dark Ages Fairy or Changeling, Dark Ages Wraith. That one, I don't know if that came out. I might be wrong about that. I know there was a Changeling one, but in any event, there was Dark Ages Inquisition. That's what it was. There was a book called Hunter the Reckoning, or a product line called Hunter the Reckoning that came out. The Inquisition took the place of Wraith in the 5-part game. So that game also had a couple of supplements released for it. It had the benefit of having all this extensive line of books that had come out for Vampire Dark Ages that expanded on the setting and some of the ideas. So they released, like a lot of second edition games do, a much tighter core rulebook. It advanced the storyline a little bit into the future, into the 13th century, I think. And then they also released some very well done and concise setting rule books for it. So they had the benefit of a longer and extensive library from Dark Ages, and then cut the bloat. This is part of the 20th anniversary line that was released by Onyx Path. Onyx Path is a successor publisher to the World of Darkness books that were, or line that was originally published by White Wolf. And the Vampire Dark Ages is the only one. They have done a Werewolf Wild West one, but it's a supplement. It's not an actual standalone game. And this is going back to more of what the original book was. It, like the other 20th anniversary editions, is very big, and at the time of recording there are 2 supplements for it, and there's also an intro one, so Dark Ages Companion and Tome of Secrets. Longtime viewers of the channel will know my affinity for the Ars Magica role-playing game. Ars Magica remains my biggest white whale. I love that game, and I have yet to get it to the table, but I have hopes in 2024 to finally land that whale without being dragged into the ocean Ahab style in doing so. But Vampire Dark Ages fit many of the same sort of sensibilities. I was, at the time, I was interested in history. I had done some reading in it, but I did not have, an extensive understanding of European history. I grew up in Winnipeg in North America, in Canada. So I didn't have exposure to a lot of osmotic exposure to European history, and the game, with so many of the different things they talked about, like the other World of Darkness games, it would mention things in it that I'd be like, what the hell is that? And how did I not know about that? And then I would read and learn more about it. And the Dark Ages book in particular appealed to me in that way. There were so many ideas and things that it referenced in it that I had no fucking clue of, which led me to eventually to one of my history minors. There's a game that was released in the historical line called Mage the Sorcerer's Crusade, which for a long time was one of my all-time favorites, and I have to thank for my history minor as well, with a focus on Renaissance and Reformation history, because I love that game so much. But this one was out several years before that. It has always appealed to me more so than what the other, while modern day Vampire doesn't necessarily appeal to me, because I think I'll feel silly, and it's no, I've talked about this before on the channel, and it is absolutely no slight to anybody who enjoys Vampire the Masquerade or playing Vampire the Masquerade. It's got a cool setup. For myself, I'd feel silly kind of playing that because I will inevitably want to make jokes about things, and people in the modern day referring to someone as my prince or whatever else is just, I don't know. The contrarian in me just has a hard time with taking that seriously necessarily. It is a failing on my part, not on the part of the game. The game is enjoyed by very, very many people, and it's a very cool thing to read. But this setting, to me, feels more appropriate. I don't have the same bouncing off of it the way I do in the modern day. And part of that is because this is pitched as like, this is the time before the Inquisition. This is the time before really there was an organized resistance to the vampires. This is a time when truly they ruled the night. And talk about embarrassing lines, my goodness. But that's something I've always loved about that. And even though I didn't find that the modern sensibilities for Vampire necessarily appealed to me, the thing I did love about it and respect about it is that it gave you great grounding, gave you a great structure in which to set your game. There were power structures within whatever city that you happen to be living in. So you had things that were ready-made as a reactive setting that you could play off of. And that, to me, is what really appeals about the Vampire Dark Ages game. It is set in, I think it's I want to say late 12th century. It went back to the original time. I'm not going to spend, unless it's really evident here on something that has a date, I won't spend too much. 1242. Okay, so it is 13th century. The core book itself has so much material. I mean, it's a huge book as well, but it has enough material to never need anything else. It's great they've got those other 2 source books out, but you would never need that. You can pick a place and you can do a little bit of research, because World of Darkness setting is not the real world. You do not need, I mean, setting aside considerations of cultural sensitivity and, you know, and whatnot, particularly if you're streaming your game, you can pick wherever the hell you want and make it whatever you want, because it doesn't matter. There's vampires in your setting. It's not the real world. It's a fictional version of it anyway. So that is something I was a Johnny come lately to realizing, that I do not need to be historically as historically accurate as I may have felt that I needed to be in past. So Dark Ages has been a long-term game that has always sat in my mind as something that is really fascinating setting. For those who aren't familiar with the storyteller system, it is a pool-based, dice pool-based game. You're rolling d10s. You are looking for a fluctuating difficulty number. Every task will have a different difficulty number with it. You're going to roll that or higher, and you count your number of successes in that compared to either the, I can't remember what it's called, is challenge level or resistance, whatever you count your number of successes, and then that will dictate whether you are successful or not. There's a crit system, crit fail system that is different across the different games. Even the 20th anniversary games, there isn't a unified rule set. Combat in 20th anniversary edition Dark Ages is different from core 20th anniversary Vampire the Masquerade. So there's a lot of permutations to that stuff, and there's a lot of different settings. But my original thought, I for a long time wanted to set something in Prague. I love one of the vampire clans that you play, the 13 clans. 13 clans make up the Camarilla, which is one of the two major organizations that was classically part of the setting, but there's some other vampire clans as well. Or maybe there is 13, I don't know. This shows my ignorance in the setting, but in any event, there's a bunch of different vampire clans, and there are bloodlines that are offshoots for those that all kind of like tie back to these original spawn of Cain. And the one of them is the Tremere, and I really dig the Tremere because they're kind of like wizard vampires. They're also one of the vampire clans that created itself after the fact, like outside of prehistory, by seizing an elder vampire from one other line and basically stealing their blood. They also, there's, in the backstory of Dracula in the setting, he also has a connection to the Tremere, because the Tremere are also quite powerful in Wallachia and Transylvania and Romania. And I always thought Prague would be a cool setting for this, because Prague is where I think it's called the Chantry. It's not necessarily called that in the other vampire things, but Chantry is a borrow word from the Tremere, or from Ars Magica, because the Tremere are a house in there as well. They're supposed to be, in the setting, mages who stole the rights of vampires and became a vampire clan, the magic vampire clan. But as far as the setting, you can pick anywhere. And lately, I've gone less away from Prague and more towards the Caucasus region, like Kingdom of Armenia, and all those different legacy kingdoms of either Byzantium or legacies of much older things like the Kingdom of Armenia, where they were largely eliminated by the Mongols. So there's this really fascinating period of kind of like Roman legacy kingdoms that carried on well up into the 13th, early 14th century, and then were just wiped out by the Mongols. And that, to me, is a setting that I think would be interesting to explore, because in the West, at least in Western Europe and in North America, so little is known about them. We ran a charity session this year that dealt with the Kingdom of Armenia as well, and part of that is because of my interest in the Caucasus region and the possibilities with vampires. So as far as the setting is concerned, you can pick anywhere you want in really in Europe at the time, and fill your boots, make the setting what you want, fill it up with what other rival vampires you want, and then just go and see what the players do, because they are power players in it. That's the part of the fun, is that seeing the players scheme and whatnot, and not necessarily, it's set up in a way that is much more sandboxy and reactive, I think, to what the players are doing, more so than just the plots, so that I think is great. The suitability for a long-term campaign, there is lots of room to grow with the characters. I've not run a long-term vampire or any White Wolf campaign, but from just crunching the math on it, it seems like the amount of XP that you're recommended to reward, you would see characters progressing, but they're not going to become godlike in the span of like a year, right? So I could be very wrong about that, and I welcome anyone who has different experience. You know, if you're following the recommended XP award system, have you found that the characters have advanced beyond what the, you know, is appropriate for the setting or the game? From what I can tell, that still seems suitable for a long-term campaign. And as far as the setting within the fiction, I definitely see that as lots of opportunity for, you know, new rivals to emerge and for them to create their offspring, you know, for them to struggle against enemies within or work with allies within the power structure and their enemies. I think it's just a fascinating setup for it. And I feel a lot more, I think, comfortable with the setting in the medieval era than I do in the modern day era, but again, it's a very personal thing. And as far as sensibilities, again, that all fits in. Deep role playing, long-term play, expansive NPCs, really interesting and diverse character like options for creating characters, and a functional rule set. It is kind of slow in combat, and it has a reputation of being just like unworkable in combat. And I think that's because people are maybe coming to it from more of a D20 perspective in some cases. There are definitely problems with it, but it's not unworkable. The game system functions. It's just that it is not designed to do that. The more recent, the 5th edition version of it, I had thought about using that because it is a much more streamlined version of the rules. It is intended that all conflicts are over in 3 rounds, because after that, like, who gives a shit? You know, there's anything interesting or whatnot that might happen in theory is going to more often than not happen in those first 3 rounds. So you should be done and on to whatever the consequences of that conflict are going to be next. But yeah, it's as far as the sensibilities, I think this definitely fits in my sensibilities very keenly. So it would make for a really, really great long-term campaign. Next up, let me take a sip of my coffee here. Now, I will apologize for the image I have for this next one, because it was next to impossible to find a nice big image of this. But next one is Adventure. Adventure is a pulp game that is part of the, what do they call it? Was it Trinity line? There were 3 games that were released. The first, I actually have the other 2 here. First released by White Wolf outside of their World of Darkness setting. Trinity was the first one, a sci-fi game that features like psychics and superhero or superpowered enemies. The next one was Aberrant, which featured modern day superheroes, and then this one, Adventure. And at the time of recording, the Onyx Path has released 3 new games. Trinity, Aberrant was 2 years ago, and then Adventure just came out this year. So there is a new version of it using new rules. I have those, and I like the story path system. I like the idea of the story path system, but I have not got it to the table enough yet. But I have got this to the table, and it was one of my favorite sessions of that year. Adventure sees you playing. One of the conceits across each of these settings is that there's some event that happens in the modern day that causes people to develop superpowers. And in that case, the modern day was, I think, 1998. Or hold on, no, I think it was set in the near future. So I think it was published maybe in 88 and it was set in 98. Is that right? It's the near future in any event. The setting was 2008. Yeah, so it was published in 1998 and it was set in 2008. And the idea was it was a near future, so it was after 10 years worth of superheroes being around in a real world. This is not a superhero role-playing game. It is a role-playing game of characters with superpowers. And that white event cascaded forward and back. And in the background, there was Adventure. Adventure was a pulp game set in the 1930s, featuring characters who had very mild degrees of superpowers in them, running from just people who were kind of a little faster, a little stronger, a little more daring than normal, up to characters who had obviously superhuman powers, like manipulating shadows or, you know, skin of bronze. It is very heavily influenced by the pulp serials, and I think it is also very heavily, based on who wrote the introduction, it is very heavily influenced by the Planetary series written by Warren Ellis. And I'm calling that out because I love Planetary. Warren Ellis is a problematic individual, so like I don't want to take this as an endorsement of him or whatnot, but the series itself is phenomenal and does something that homages so many different settings and genres and whatnot that it is unequaled in any other setting or any other comic thing. However, because it's so linked to homage and there's a degree of cynicism to it, it doesn't truly, I think, capture the pulp sensibilities. It does kind of a Philip Jose Farmer thing where it takes them but adds a bit of a dark twist to them, which to me doesn't, like, you're not necessarily carrying on the spirit of the pulps. You are taking what is the settings and the tropes and whatnot of the pulps and adding a very modern sensibility to it. And I'm not sure, like that. I've struggled for a long time trying to figure out what kind of pulp thing I would want to run. As a kid, there was a radio station in my hometown that would play the old on Sunday nights. They would play Theater of the Mind, which would include a bunch of shadow stories. So from a kid, I would sit up on Sunday night, have the radio turned down low enough next to my bed so my parents couldn't hear it, but I could sit up and listen to the shadow until I was up way later than I was supposed to be. So I've always had an attraction for those characters. And there's a lot of pulp inspired stuff like Planetary, like Tom Strong, like the Philip Jose Farmer books, like the Tarzan book, and there's a which I can't remember the name of, and there's one about Doc Savage that I also enjoy. But there's been something, for one, the session I played with Adventure, it was a lot of fun. The 3 different types of characters you can play are mesmerists, adventuring type I think they're called, oh gosh, I can't remember what the second, daredevils I think is one, mesmerists is a second, and then there are, they're not called wonders, but it's something like that. And basically what it is whether you are kind of like a very highly skilled human like, you know, Tarzan, or any of the heroic aviators from the period, or like Black Hawk maybe, or the mesmerists are like, you know, Shadow, or anyone who's got kind of a mental kind of psychic type of power. And then there's the other version, which I'm just gonna look it up because it's gonna drive me bonkers otherwise. You are either playing, where is it here? Oh my goodness. Where is it? So there's mesmerists, there are stalwarts. Stalwarts are the ones that have the superhuman powers. Forgive me. It's going to drive me nuts if I didn't have that. So the setting sees you playing one of those characters. The rule set is a streamlined version of the original World of Darkness game. It is, I found at the table, much more playable. It was a little faster. It's not as abstracted as what the story path system is. The story path takes some cues from things like Fate or the 2D20 system or Savage Worlds and then incorporates them into a mechanic. And it's interesting, but I've struggled the couple of times I've run it so far. So I did not struggle similarly with the set of Adventure. Now, my comments about the, you know, pulp with a darker twist stuff, you may think, and then I think, oh, there's not good, you know, pulp to draw from. What ideas you might have to run it. That was, over the past year, I have been working my way through the entire Hellboy library. If you're not familiar with Hellboy, I mean, I'm not sure who wouldn't be because of the films, but, you know, and especially if you're listening to this channel, you know who Hellboy is, maybe only from the films. It's a comic character originally from the 1990s who I had not revisited since then. I wasn't familiar with what other books came out. Then another game we're going to talk about a little later today came out, and I realized the depth of the library, and I started diving in. I think my favorite, setting aside the Hellboy series itself, of those is Lobster Johnson. Lobster Johnson, at the time of recording, has 2 omnibuses out that collect all. This one only came out this year. This collects the stories of Hellboy's kind of pulp hero, their version of the Avenger or the Shadow or, you know, the Spider. It is such a good series, not only because it's just fantastic art, great stories, terrific villains. It fits beautifully in the grander Hellboy, you know, mythology, but it also tells gripping pulp stories without a degree of, they don't feel dated, but they capture the same feel and the same spirit of the pulps, the way that the cynicism, I think, or the pessimism maybe from Planetary or the Farmer books don't. And I love that, because that's one of the things I love about there are definitely some problems with the pulp stories. Not only that they're, you know, some are kind of formulaic, kind of pretty formulaic, but it's how you approach that stuff and how you express it and how you add in new fun ideas for what is otherwise a kind of mystery of the week type thing, or at least a structure for it. This emulates and transcends the pulp stuff, and that inspires me to what you could do with adventure, setting aside the fact that the series begins in either the late 20s or the early 30s, but each series advances a year or 6 months. And that's definitely how you could do this. Anytime you're setting a campaign in the 1930s, there is an inevitable endpoint where your world is going to transform. Unless you change your world, you're going to see something happen in 1939. And I mean, to be honest, that's only in Europe. You'll be seeing things earlier in, 33, when Japan invades China. Forgive me if I've got that wrong. I'm sure someone in chat might correct me on that. But the fascinating thing about that is that you could easily structure, even if you choose not to like skip forward to, you know, you also incorporate a Barons and Trinity, because there are story elements that carry forward from adventure into those times. Although interestingly, the games were published in the reverse order, so you sort of learned the history of some of these characters as you went back. But you could do an amazing campaign with this, that really feels like it is transcending, like capturing, but also transcending the pulp things, in the sense of there is a continuity that is happening. And as the world is changing, as pulp changes from the serials into what would, you know, succeed them by way of comic books, you could definitely play that kind of stuff. You could also even play a campaign up to, you know, whenever you feel like it's time to pull the plug, and then pick up in 1950. See where the game is and see where your world is. And that's the other fascinating thing that I really love about the exploring the Hellboy backstory, is their world has deep history based on the odd and like weird tales and occultic stories and paranormal things that happened in the past. I'm not going to spoil anything for anyone who is unfamiliar with Hellboy, but I love that what you're seeing in Hellboy in the 1994 book, which starts in 1945 and then fast forwards to the mid 90s, I think 94. That world that you're seeing there, you get to see how everything came about through this library of Hellboy. And I think that's what is another just amazing possibility with this. Just because history played out the way things did in our world does not mean you need to take that as a given. It's an idea I've been playing with Acton Cthulhu, because I really like the 2D20 version of the Acton Cthulhu. I like, honestly, both versions, but the 2D20 one is the current version in print from Modiphius. And it's something I love about that is thinking about, okay, what's the world going to look like after this? When you have, you know, Allied and Axis mystics who are part of this thing, what does that world look like in the Cold War? What does it look like during the Korean War? You know, and that is something I think that you can play with this as well. You don't need to. You can just play a straightforward, incredible pulp campaign. But it's another thing you could play with if you like that idea, if you like the idea of legacy or whatever. Anyone who reads any of the, you know, any Justice Society of America thing published after 1998, say. I think 98 is when Golden Age came out. Anything after that has that very conscious focus on legacy and stuff you can steal for this thing. So setting, anything that is appropriate for pulp setting you can fit in this. That's amazing. Suitability for long-term play, again, advanced. If you're following the rules as written, it seems as if your characters would not outpace the game, in the sense that they would be too powerful to be challenged, or the game might break down because you're rolling too many dice or whatnot. There's a hard cap on how many dice you roll in the game, so you're never going to get more powerful than a certain point, which means you're expanding out rather than up power level. And the setting itself could also transform. You know, I just read one of the Hellboy series that is set in the 30s, featuring the heroes are a bunch of nationalist Chinese intelligence agents, and the rival they're facing is a supernatural Japanese threat. And the thing, it's a great series called Crimson Lotus, but the thing I kept thinking about afterwards, I'm like these people's world is utterly transformed by the time the mid 1940s rolls around. And that's something that I think is a lot of pulp stuff talks about lost worlds in the very, what do you call it, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle sense of like dinosaurs and whatnot too. But there are so many lost worlds that exist in history at that era that just are gone, by the time the 40s finishes. And I think that is incredible. Like if you are interested in history in that sense, and you do find that stuff appropriate for a role-playing game, those are all things you can also explore here too, which is, again, I think really, really interesting. So, and as far as sensibilities, given my raving about this, I expect maybe that's an unnecessary, an unnecessary category, given that these are all going to be ones that fit my sensibilities. So maybe I'll explain why I think it fits my sensibilities. I love being able to come up with whatever the fuck I want for a setting, as far as an explanation or a development. That having that kind of freedom allows you to really, especially for high-powered campaigns, allows you to kind of go wherever players take you. And in a setting like this, where there's that very strong pulp, unknown, kind of stuff, the setting and the rules allow me to introduce whatever I want, whatever kind of, master race of apes from the future coming back, an underground kingdom, a secret society of mystics, the remnants of some lost civilization. Anything I want, I can introduce into the game. And that is something that definitely fits my sensibilities. I like introducing that stuff because I want the players to do stuff like that too. When they're playing superheroes or pulp heroes, it's incredible to me when they're doing things where I'm like, that's so fucking cool. I would not have thought of that. In that kind of fun Star Trek, pseudoscience or comic book science kind of way. So in that way, specific way, I think that adventure definitely appeals, to my sensibilities. Let's grab a sip of coffee as I go to the next. Hi, everybody in chat. I hope everyone is having a wonderful Boxing Day. The next up is Embers of the Imperium. Now, this is a setting for a game that I had years ago published a very unflattering review of, Genesis. And while I do stand by what I said in that, Genesis has subsequently expanded into this. Oops, here we go. The Expanded Player's Guide. This is very much a Game Master's Guide. For those who aren't familiar with Genesis, it's not a very eye-catching cover. This is effectively the setting-free version of the rules that drove the Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars games. So 3 games that they released for the setting, or for Star Wars: Edge of the Empire, Age of Rebellion, and Force and Destiny. And then they released some, setting or system-free, at least not linked to any one of them, some generic Star Wars stuff as well before that game kind of died. It had I can't imagine what more they would add to it, but they took the game mechanics that were in there and they released a generic role-playing game for it. And since this has come out, they have released 4 different setting books at the time of recording. The Realms of Terranoth, which is a fantasy setting. There is the Shadow of the Beanstalk, which is the setting from the Android card game that they also released a setting book for. And something Crucible, which is a really unusual multi-genre setting that from what I understand, it relates to some card game that they released. I own it. I don't really like it all that much. They've also released but I don't like it because it doesn't fit my sensibilities, not because it's a bad product. And the final one is this Embers of the Imperium. And alongside this, they had also set up a open license so anybody can create anything they want for it. So there's some amazing supplements that add in fear rules or horror settings or Indiana Jones or, martial arts type settings or whatever. A ton of third-party stuff that has been created for it. And the Twilight Imperium, Ambers of the Imperium setting is from their board game of the same name, this massive, game. I have played it once, and I do not have enough hours in my life to be able to play it again because it took for fucking ever, and I did not really enjoy I did not find that the experience was satisfying enough, even with the number of players we played with. But the setting itself, however, in the same way, my criticism of this was that it was intending to be a toolbox, but there weren't enough tools in there. They have since expanded on that, so I think that there is enough in there now, and this is a phenomenal toolbox. Not only because it gives you a variety, it gives you some elements of the setting, so it gives you a place to go. Like Savage Worlds, it also gives you a structure to it. They introduced this idea of basically a team of intergalactic, it's all in the same galaxy, I think, interstellar troubleshooters that are called, I want to say, Kelleries? Yeah, K-E-L-E-R-E-S, the Kelleries. Is that right? Yeah. They are, from what I've only played partway through the Mass Effect games, but there's a role that the characters to take on. It's not called Ranger, it's something like that. There's a troubleshooter for the interstellar people. You're kind of like a Texas Marshal, but across the galaxy. And that's what these characters are. And there's phenomenal art in here, and lots of opportunities for making different characters. Obviously, they can come from a wide variety of different species. Humans are in this as well, and there's cat people who are super fucking cool. But there's also really unusual things like balls of sentient gas, or gigantic robots, or I don't know. There's some hawk people in it, and so that stuff is kind of fun, but that's sort of, again, standard kind of fare for a lot of sci-fi settings. There is no magic in this. There's no magic, there's no force, there's no sonic powers, apart from very specific for one of the races. So that means that you're not playing a game like Star Wars, where the Force users might either overpower or have a bigger presence than what the other members of the group might be. But there is also, it allows it to be a space opera setting that is quasi hard science, in the sense that there isn't magic in the setting. Still is, it's a very space opera setting. But one of the things that I think is just amazing about it is how modular the thing is. They give you basics information for different weapons or gear or armor or starships. I'm saying that, Anna. Anna says hi to everyone and wishes you all a very merry Boxing Day. Starships from scout ship, individual things, all the way up to massive battleships. But then it gives you also, for each of the different species, ways to tweak those things to fit with the different species. So what you have here is a limitless set of possibilities for running a space opera setting that divorces itself from some of the more science fantasy elements that you see in other settings. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Star Wars, I love Starfighter, I love science fantasy. I think it's fucking awesome. But there is an appeal as well to having a setting that is unique, in the sense that it doesn't have any of that stuff, but it's still space opera. And I mentioned earlier about Savage Worlds, about certain games having there's experiences you get with them that you just don't get with other games. And the Genesis system, or the Fantasy Flight Star Wars system, is one of those games. There are, because of the way, if you're not familiar, it uses proprietary dice, which is, it is what it is. There's a free Roll20 sheet that has an API script to roll all the dice for you. So if you wanted to run this online in person, you never have to pay a dime to get those extra special dice. But there are 6 kinds of dice, I think. 5 or 6 kinds of dice, color coded. They have names, but they're green, yellow, which are like good dice. One is kind of good, yellow or even better. Purple, which are kind of bad, and red dice, kind of even worse. And then there are also blue and black dice, so there's 6, and there's force dice as well, so 7 kinds of dice. Blue and black are situational modifiers, positive or negative. The red and let's see here, the red, purple, yellow, and green all represent your various skill levels or your training or your abilities. All task resolution uses those. You count the number of different successes or advantages or setbacks or failures. I can't remember what they call them in the game, but basically you're looking to count up the number of successes and the number of either positive or negative situational modifiers. There are also triumphs and despairs, which are like critical successes, critical failures. But because of the way that the task resolution works, you put all your factors into one dice and you roll them, you get results that are just not seen in many other games. And I would say most other games, because you have an axis of success and fail that is independent from the situational modifiers. So you might have, like I've used this as an example on stream before, but if you're hacking, you're in a hangar and you're trying to hack a door before the, to get in and access a ship so you can get away. If you succeed, but you get a despair, you succeed and the door opens up, but the despair is you find guards waiting in there for you. Or similarly, you fail, but you find some helpful thing. An opposite situation. You aren't able to get in there, but your triumph is a guy, walking along, whistling, throwing the keys to the ship that you need up and down in the air. So now you can present yourself with an opportunity. And there are lesser advantages and setbacks that come from those lesser results, but it just means that there are results you see at the table that are unlike any other results, and it is in any other game. And there's an element of emergent play that comes from those, because collectively you're all sitting around and looking like, okay, what could this mean? What could this mean? What could this triumph be in the situation? And players might suggest some stuff, or the game master might decide for themselves, but it makes for just some really unpredictable results, which are fun and not unpredictable. The converse of that is that as the dice pools get larger, they get really wacky. So what I found is that with very long-term play, like 2 years of play, the game, I found Star Wars was losing the fun with it, and just like it was every dice pool, because there were so many factors that were kind of going into it, it was really hard to predict what the outcome was going to be. And I think that is an issue. Looking back to my setting, suitability, sensibilities thing, that is something that I ran into with the Star Wars games, and that remains an issue. But I had never played with house rules with that, and I have subsequently started incorporating some house rules using narrative metacurrencies to adjust different results in games. So that is one way of blunting that aspect of it. As far as suitability too, that was after a very long term of play and a very overly generous game master. I gave way too much XP, so characters were advancing much faster than they did. And I've heard from other game masters since who have said that they have not run into problems with the amount of XP. So I think I may have just been, I don't think I was creative enough to respond to some of those problems. So in any event, as far as suitability for long-term play, the setting itself, the fiction, is limitless. Like you jet from planet to planet to your troubleshooting. If you think of like what happened in Mass Effect in the kind of overall story for that is definitely the type of story you could tell in this setting. Star Wars, likewise, less Star Wars, because there's not one big bad guy. More of the prequels, I think, is what you could probably tell in this thing. But really, the fun thing I think about the setting is you don't need to put the whole galaxy in trouble. Like, putting an entire planet in peril is very pulp, and is very what kind of, you know, the scope that Star Wars used to shoot for. One of the things they used to say in the original West End Games Star Wars role-playing game was that to get you thinking in terms of Star Wars scope, Star Wars doesn't threaten a town or a city. It threatens planets or solar systems. They don't, you know, attack. They don't have, you know, a single swamp you're going to go to. There's an entire planet that has that, you know, biome or ecosystem. And you could definitely play with all those same sensibilities in this setting. And you definitely can put the, you know, the galaxy at threat, because there's some really interesting adversaries that are in the setting, but you don't need to. You can still have a really high stakes game. I mean, there's billions of sentients who are at stake, and particularly if you make the players care about where they go. You know, one of the things that this is a bit of a non sequitur, but I was reading about planetary romance in preparation for our upcoming Starfinder game this coming weekend at the time of recording. And I was reading about planetary romance, and one of the things that if you're not familiar with it, planetary romance is that kind of like John Carter, people go swords and planet, they sometimes call it. You go to another world, you know, and there's crazy wild adventures there. Star Wars owes a degree of sensibility to that. And for a long time, I thought planetary romance referred to the kind of like, and then you find a love interest there and then whatever else. And that's true in some cases. You know, Dejathoris or Taurus is definitely a character that is emblematic of that, but it's not only about that. And planetary romance is also about the planets themselves, the setting, the exoticism, and the wild, literally alien nature of the worlds you go to, with the people you encounter, the biomes you encounter. That's the stuff that is a romance of the planets themselves, not just the overall sense of it being a romance story in addition to being an adventure story. And that is something I think that you definitely could incorporate in this, the idea of really embracing how wild and unpredictable and exotic this vast universe that your characters are adventuring in, vast galaxy, are adventuring in, because you can go anywhere. Science fiction settings always have different kind of ways of setting up how you get around and whatnot, and this is a great setup for that kind of troubleshooter campaign for this game. So I think as far as suitability, the setting is great. I've had problems with the XP outpacing the characters in the game before, but that I chalk up to inexperience, and I think I probably could come up with a solution for dealing with that. And as far as sensibilities are concerned, I love it. It gives me a solid tool set, so I don't need to learn a whole bunch of different things. I don't need to have you know, a ton of different source books to draw, like, oh, here's what this race's guns are like, and here's what that race's guns are like. I just need to use one and tweak it with the rules in this source book. So, cycling back, while I was critical of the Genesis rulebook initially for being what it was proposing to be, this I think is fantastic. Phenomenal source book as far as a toolbox, a true toolbox where you can use it to build something is concerned. Really well done by them, and would make for a fantastic adventure. Next up is, man, how am I going to get through 32 games in this next one? Next one is Hellboy. Hellboy is, I've talked about them at length, or the game, or the setting at length. If you want to get a sense of how much Hellboy there is, wow. My Christmas present to myself this year was the monster-sized Hellboy, which collects just the solid Hellboy stories. I have these already in a different format, but I've read them all, and now that I've spent the year getting caught up in the Hellboy library, my plan for 2024 is every day I'm going to read an issue of Hellboy. I'm going to make my way through Monster Size, now seeing what the scope of the story is, go back to the original and make my way through that in this format. That is just the core narrative, though. There is so much more to it. And I've talked about Lobster Johnson. You can find a ton. Like, there are dozens of BPRD, the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense, books that are incredible. And there's a bunch of ones set in different time periods. So, you know, one series in 1946, 1947, 48, all the way up at the time of recording to 57, I think is the most recent one. But there are also other ones, like, you know, there's a whole miniseries on Koschei, the Deathless. And one of my favorites, a very close comparator for non-Hellboy stuff, is Witchfinder. At the time of recording, there are 2 of these, 2 omnibuses out for it. This is about Sir Edward Grey, a mystic detective in the vein of kind of like those, you know, Sherlock Holmesian English investigator types, but set in the mystic occultic world of Hellboy's Victorian era. They are fantastic stories. They're so fun. The transformation the character undergoes over time, just like Lobster Johnson, it evokes a lot of the same sensibilities that I love about those Victorian, you know, stories or Victorian characters, but in the kind of like Penny Dreadful kind of sense. But it also adds the progression of time to it and the transformation and the development of these characters over time. And I mention that only not to rave about that series any longer than I need to, but because the Hellboy RPG, wow, it allows you to run. The setup for it is in the as investigators working for the BPRD. It uses a modified version of the 5th edition engine. Your characters, though, like, you don't start at first level. You're recommended to start, I believe, at 5th, and you can create anything. It is. Let's see here. Okay, we had a brief disconnection. Sorry for those listening at home. What I was saying was that the structure for the game is you're playing members of the Bureau of Paranormal Research and Development, but you can set it whenever you like. I won't spoil any aspects of the BPRD storyline or the Hellboy storyline in general, but the BPRD itself dates back to the mid-40s, right after the Second World War. There's also source material you can draw on for during the war, for during the interwar period, like Lobster Johnson or the Crimson Lotus, or even further back, and you would have the tools you would need to be able to run whatever you like in this. It is a very well done it's a very well done game that fits that specific type of gameplay of playing a member of the BPRD. One of the recurring things in the stories themselves is supplies. You know, at times the BPRD is flush with as much stuff as they need, and at times they struggle with their budgets and whatnot. And, you know, some of the stuff you're seeing in the Monarch series that is ongoing right now on Apple TV, there's some elements of what the BPRD history is. BPRD is much more wild than that. But yeah, that's the setting. And there's an interesting mechanic. There's a couple of like moving parts in the game with respect to Doom, and there's another narrative meta-currency that I can't remember. And come on over here, Anna says hi to everyone. Another narrative meta-currency that the game masters make use of, and the players make use of, I should say. There's also a like equipment or a outfitting phase to each mission too, so you can like pick gear and stuff like that. The G.I. Joe game does that as well, but it seems interesting. I've not got it to the table, so it could very well be a mess, but what I see in there as far as what you can do to make characters, what types of characters you can make, what types of adventures you can go on, and the tools, I should say, they gave the game master. There are also like structured clues that you can find, so there is a bit of a clear, like, you're investigating mystery and here's what you find over the course of the mystery structure. And there are games that, like City of Mist does a similar thing to that, and it does it successfully. It makes it part of the fun mystery and part of the fun gameplay. And I think that it seems to be the same way in this. It would be similarly really fun to go through. And the setting itself, comic books in general, I said to a friend recently, comic books in American comics are part of the reason I love them so much is because they are this amalgam of all these different other genres. They're different ideas and sensibilities and story types all mashed together. So you got some fantasy, you got some sci-fi, you got crime, you got pulp stuff in there, as well as all the other influences that have come subsequently. And Hellboy is a great distillation of the interests of one specific creator, of taking all those things that he happens to love and incorporating them into one mythos, one expansive, 20-plus year character history. Not only the character, but also the world itself. And those all happen to fit squarely within my own sensibilities of what I love and the kind of things I want to play role-playing games dealing with. So the setting itself also, it just enormously appeals to me. And many of the things that inspired like Gygax or Dungeons and Dragons or any of that weird fiction stuff, in particular, Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerer's Hyperborea, the stronger influences on that game definitely are at play in Hellboy. I jokingly posted, I read one of the Hellboy or Young Hellboy stories, and that one story happened to involve a mysterious missing island, a aviator from the 1930s who had gone missing, a vampiric sorcerer queen from before recorded history, a sentient group of or village of elves, and a helpful giant monkey that also had a mystical secret to them, all in the same, and dinosaurs. So all of that was happening in the same 4-issue series, and that's, in my mind, Hellboy in a nutshell. And it's all I would want from this kind of like modern day, or even like, near modern type of investigative, supernatural, urban, fantasy type game. Clear structure for what you're doing in the game, solid, rules underpinning it, and a fascinating setting that offers the game master unlimited creativity for what they want to introduce to it. So as far as suitability is concerned, I really don't know. I mean, like you can always keep up scaling the threats. It's based on 5e, and I've heard from folks who run more 5e than what I do that game runs into difficulties math-wise at higher levels, but honestly, I am hard-pressed to think of what games don't. So I don't know. I mean, like, I may be hand-waving away a potential issue with this one, but I think the setting and the interesting characters you can make with it, and the unusual way of structuring adventures as far as clues and outfitting and the fluctuating narrative meta currencies are concerned would definitely make for a really interesting game at the table, and hopefully for something that would be long-term and that you could also visit across space and time with war stories, which I am always interested in doing. So that's Hellboy. Next up, Iron Kingdom's Requiem. So the Iron Kingdoms game was originally a setting. It was originally a series of adventures, the Witchfire trilogy, and that quickly expanded out. It was published at the early outset of the D20/OGL boom, but it just so happened it was largely driven by two artists who set up Privateer Press. The original publishers were Brian Snowdy and Matt, what's Matt's last name? Not Wagner. That's how Matt Wilson. Matt D. Wilson, who was an artist that I happen to love from his work on, among other things, Legend of the Five Rings. He did a lot of my favorite cards from Legend of the Five Rings. The book itself, or the setting itself, is the original adventure was gorgeous. Had Brian Snowdy black and white art in it. It was great, really neat, kind of steampunk setting, very different from what you would get in any other D&D setting. That expanded out to eventually being a 3.5 setting, a series of books, and then some other supplements that came out for it, including a Monsternomicon. It then kind of fell off, and during the heyday of the 4th edition era, they published their own. Well, in the interim, they began publishing a miniature game. First was called War Machine, and then a supplemental one, or kind of a different unit, called Hordes, both of which featured bands of warriors from the setting fighting one another. The setting was then expanded into a role-playing game that was based on the mechanics of the tabletop game called Iron Kingdom's Role-Playing Game. And regular viewers of the channel will know that I adore that game. I ran it for about 2.5 years. At the time, I kind of soured on 4th edition. There wasn't another one. Pathfinder First Edition was just not, it reminded me too much of Third Edition, and at the time I was very cold on that. So we got to playing that with the core rulebook, and it was incredible. It was a really fun return to a setting that I really did enjoy with the original adventures. And then the line died. With 5th edition coming out, I think that they started considering what they might do with it, and I'm not sure how successful the role-playing game was, the Iron Kingdoms RPG. They released some fantastic books for it, as well as a second game that was actually set in kind of the same cultures that were featured in the Hordes miniatures game. But in spite of that, the game just, I don't know, they just stopped kind of publishing it. There was supposed to be a source book that was going to come out to cover 3 different regions that were long ignored, and we just never got it. And then, years later, they announced that they're doing a 5th edition, Iron Kingdoms Requiem. And at the time of recording, I'm going to try, there's a ton of, they've done 4 successful, I think now 5 successful Kickstarters, either 4 or 5. The original one was the Requiem book, but the product line is currently, so Requiem, I'm just going to hold up I don't know which ones came out when. The Borderlands Survival Guide, the Borderlands and Beyond, Nightmare Empire, the Replacement Monster Nomicon, a Scoundrel's Guide to the Shard Isles, a free RPG day one-shot or series of adventures set around a group called the Strange Light Workshop, set in the City of Ghosts, Corvus. Tales from the Blackwater Cantina, an adventure compilation, a re-release of the Legends of Witchfire adventure, the Shadow of the Seeker, a more elven-focused a little mini adventure, compilation of the digital stuff. They, as they did for the Iron Kingdoms RPG, they were releasing regular digital content, which kind of drove me fucking nuts as someone who likes having stuff in print. So I'm glad they're doing these digital compilations now. More Monster Nomicon, the Lost Pages, Into the Deep Wild. This is the most recent one, Into the Deep Wild, and Deep Wild Expeditions. So the setting itself is a world of a bunch of different nations that have very loose, very, very loose cognates to some real-world settings. There's a kind of German-British setting. There's a kind of Italian city-state setting. There's a kind of, well, not kind of. There's one that is very definitely Russian, Ukrainian, or at least Slavic. I don't want to, that's a very fucking poor thing to lump together given current events. I apologize for that to anyone listening from Ukraine. What I mean by that is Eastern European. There's a setting that is very Eastern European, and the reason I'm distinguishing between the two is because in the setting itself, they have a distinction between 2 different cultural groups, one of which seems to be very Russian influenced, and one of which seems to be very Ukrainian influenced. So my apologies for trying to suggest that they're one and the same. My intention was to make the distinction between the two, but in any event, the so there's a quasi, Eastern European kind of vibe, and there is also a version of dwarves, a version of elves too. In fact, there's a version of but many other sort of signature races. There's no halflings or gnomes, but there are goblins or gobbers that come in a variety of things. So the setting has these different nations that struggle against one another. There's this very advanced technology that is based on very kind of magic-y steampunk type stuff, and driven by a kind of specific magical engineering that is done by, I think they're called Arcanics, mechanic with a K. And there are warlocks who can command, or have special magical links with giant monsters, and there are warcasters who can have links to the magical, like, robot brain that drives these massive robot kind of or things called war machines. And the setting itself is it's much closer to Victorian era or pre-World War I in terms of tech level than any other setting. So it's not like just the Victorian era. It's actually much closer to kind of like an Old West type thing, guns proliferate with multiple, you know, chambers in them. There's machine guns. It's just a really fucking cool setting. Very unlike anything else. And one thing they do with the 5th edition version of it is they don't just try and go back to what they did with the 3rd edition and just be like, okay, here's how you adapt this class to fit in here. They very much make it their own, and they offer you alternate rules to present a very uniquely Iron Kingdom type of game. Like, for instance, healing in Iron Kingdoms in the fiction is not, like magical healing, is not a painless process either for the person who receives it or the person who does it. There's no reincarnation or... Nah, there might be a reincarnation. There's definitely no raise dead spells. So you don't get to just, like, if someone dies in the setting, they're dead. Many other, like, planar travel spells don't function the way they do, if they function at all. So it is a much more, like, less wildly magical setting than what traditional D&D is, but there are all those elements of D&D in there. They also add in some other neat ideas that were taken from the Iron Kingdoms role-playing game, where you have these things called archetypes, which is basically like, what, broadly speaking, type of character are you playing? Not your class or your profession, but what type? Are you a mage? Are you a strong character? Are you a skilled character? Are you gifted? Those are ideas they've carried over and given you an optional way of approaching them. They also have a neat way of approaching narrative meta currency and of handling resources like, you know, coal for your war machines or your various magical devices. That's really clever. They have a much better balanced way of creating the kind of arcana tech magic items in it as well. They had rules for that in the Iron Kingdoms RPG, but they were really sketchy and really broken, so you could end up with just abusively powerful things. So I loved running the Iron Kingdoms role-playing game, but my house rules were very extensive by the time we, you know, nearly completed that game. It's the only game where I came within, gosh, like about 10% or 20% of the XP to see characters go from brand new characters to the very end game. Is the only game I've ever done that with. And this seems to be much more balanced. There's an enormous amount of material for it too. So you can set your game anywhere you want in the Iron Kingdoms. The types of stories you can tell in it, if you think of what you could do in Eberron or in Ravnica or in any other kind of like fairly modern, in the sense of like mass communication is an easily accessible thing, long distance travel is relatively easily accessible by most characters. That's the kind of stories you could tell in this. And it's also, I mean, you could definitely tell war stories as well. But I mean, you could have a great monster hunting campaign or ghost hunting campaign set around the Strange Light Workshop in the City of Ghosts, Corvus. I think my favorite setting, my favorite city. I set my campaign. No, we didn't. We set ours in a separate thing for our ongoing campaign, but I had one game set in the City of Ghosts. It's a fascinating setting too, with some really fun twists on some sensibilities. I won't spoil anything for anyone who wishes to you know, get into it, to enjoy learning about the setting, because that is definitely something I really enjoyed when I first started running Iron Kingdoms. And there's an enormous amount of fun, different ancestries your characters can come from too. So just in the illustration I've got up here, you can see there's a dwarf in there, and dwarves have this neat relationship with a species that is kind of the ersatz half orc or ersatz ogre, called the Ogren, and they've got a very specific relationship with the dwarves in the setting. The elves are both, there's the Nissian elves who are devoted to one of their remaining goddesses, and there are the Iosan elves who are from the elven homeland, but they are an extremely doomed people. It's just a really interesting setting. Characters are fascinating in it, and the 5th edition version of it offers a ton of great material. And the only reason I had not got this to the table before is partly because there's just so many other 5e settings, and I was not running a lot of 5e at the time. I have now been running for about 6 months 5th edition in our Night Below campaign. I'm feeling much more confident in my assessment of like how to tweak the game to fit the way I want it to play. So I think you can really make a fantastic campaign out of this as well. Getting back to my largely abandoned criteria setting, there's an enormous amount of scope of what you could do with a setting. War stories, veterans, espionage, magical adventures, exploration. One of the things that was a problem with the Iron Kingdoms RPG is that there was this fun kind of like exploration element to it, but so much of the world was undetailed that like, where the fuck do you go? It's like the original edition of 7th Sea. I have these great swashbuckling characters and massive tall ships I can go by, but I have nowhere to fucking go other than Airsats Europe. That is not the case anymore. You got lots of expansion into where you want to go with it. So the setting is great. Suitability, no more so or less so than any other version of 5th edition. And for sensibilities for me, I know I love this setting. So this only offers me more scope to what the setting would be. So this likewise would be a fantastic setting. One of the setups, just as an example, that we played originally, we had the characters become basically the sheriffs or the law enforcement for one specific region. I used an adventure I'm currently running in our Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay adventure. It's something called Noblesse Oblige, reworked for Iron Kingdoms. That kicked off our campaign. There was a MacGuffin the characters were hunting for, some other kind of behind the scenes shit going on, but largely they were the ones who were the forces for this one, backwater Cadoran lord. And yeah, they would have to, our campaign ended before we really got to it, but it would have been them, once they really had roots in this area, once they really cared about the people there, then they would see the war come and would have to deal with that. So I think there's just a great amount of possibilities in the setting for making interesting and engaging long-term campaigns with it. So that is that. We're on the home stretch, folks. Next up is, where did I put them? Here we go. Wow. Another 5th edition campaign, and this one is just more so my sensibilities for Horde. Did I forget to turn one off? No, I didn't. Okay. Next up is Grim Hollow. Grim Hollow is a setting published by, what is it here? Ghostfire Games, I think. Yeah, Ghostfire Gaming. A bunch of guys who are hobbyists who got into the publishing, and just based on the material they've published for this setting and some of the other unique settings they put out so far, are absolutely fucking knocking it out of the park. Grim Hollow is a gothic, think of Ravenloft, but a consistent setting. It also has the pitch of the characters they have rules for characters becoming infected by things like becoming a lich or a vampire or a werewolf or whatever. I don't mean to dismiss that stuff. It's a neat idea, just not necessarily. I think there's a lot more to the setting than just that one elevator pitch. It's a fascinating setting, gorgeous art, and their monster grimoire that's been released for it has some fantastic, just devilishly evil, insidious monsters. If you have been watching our Night Below campaign, the Suture Golem comes from this, and there are similarly just horrific monsters to go with this. And they have also released a player's guide for it since the original, so lots of opportunities to tweak the game. Like Iron Kingdoms, they also offer some suggestions for how to tweak the 5e rules to fit more with the grim, and gothic sensibilities of the setting. They've also released a really fucking cool, they've got monster cards, which a lot of settings do, but they also have one on bounties, and basically it's an entire card deck just of ideas of complete with in-universe text. So players, you could hand out bounty cards, say this is what's available, what do you want to do? Lots of different ways you can structure your campaign. Unlike some of the other ones I've talked about, there isn't a assumed or default campaign structure to this, but there is, creatures or heroes who are going against the dark, like Blackbirds, another game we fucking love and haven't run since last year, actually. Blackbirds has a setting where the gods are dead. Grim Hollow likewise has that, and it is rival devils and angels who are scrambling in the interim to try and take the place of their missing godheads that are granting powers and are struggling in this dark world. So it's just got an enormous amount of, I think that what appeals to me most about it is in Ravenloft, if you take the setting at its face, there is never a chance for the heroes to triumph because it is a demi-plane of dread. There's no reason that the dread would be like, you know what? For this one time, we're going to take a break from the dread. So you can defeat whomever. And like that's also a fun of that hopeless struggle against, you know, undefeatable evil or replacing, you know, taking its place at best. That is a really cool idea. But if you want to play a campaign where the players do have a sense of, or at least a possibility of triumphing, I like the setup for this. It's a very dark world, and definitely things are stacked against our heroes, not only because of the house rules that they have in Grim Hollow, but also because of the setting itself and the supernatural things that are turning against the heroes. But it gives that fully fleshed kind of clear setting that Ravenloft gave you fun snippets of. It's obviously not Ravenloft, so like I don't mean to say that this is a better version of Ravenloft. It offers a different take that I think would make for a less fatalistic long-term campaign. So that is Grim Hollow. And this, even if you're a 5th edition dungeon master and all you want are some devilishly creative monsters, fuck, there's some amazing. This book is 420 pages long and is full of just things that made me chuckle when I'm reading them. Like, I can't wait to use that. On a lighter note, for an ongoing campaign is our next one. So as far as our 3 criteria setting, suitability, sensibilities, suitability no more so and less so mechanically than what 5th edition would be otherwise. Sensibilities, I love me some horror stuff, but I also like that there is some opportunity for heroes to hope. So I like that about the setting, and I think that there's lots of opportunity. Even if players defeat one evil, it just draws the attention of a bigger, badder evil. So that sounds fucking awesome to me. On a lighter note, our final entry in the 5th edition genre, Brancalonia. Brancalonia is advertised as the spaghetti fantasy RPG. It is a setting for 5th edition. It's not a game in and of itself, just like Grim Hollow and like Iron Kingdoms, but it is set in a fantasy Italy that is heavily inspired by the spaghetti Western films of Sergio Leone. So not really heroes you're playing. They're more rough and tumble characters. There's also an embrace of Italian folklore that is really interesting. The authors are Italian, the publisher is Italian, and it is one of the most interesting and evocative, clear expressions of a setting that I've ever seen. The supplements that have been released for it thus far are Brancalonia, the core book, the Jinx's Almanac, which adds some additional rules and setting stuff, the Macarona, what is it called? Macaronicon? I may be pronouncing that wrong. More additional supplemental rules to add in some other unusual ancestries to play, and then the mega campaign, The Empire Whacks Back. I will say, if either playing characters with a 70s cinema sensibility, but with or aesthetics, I should say, but with also elements taken from Italian folklore, like, you know, speaking, walking cats, or, you know, bodiless spirits who inhabit, you know, armor, or Pinocchio type puppets or marionettes. If that puts you off, the setting's probably not going to be for you. And that's fine. Like, the game is a very distinct expression of what it is. It caps out at, I think, 5th or 6th level, so you're never going to see beyond that. But there are things that you can gain beyond that. So the game, your character doesn't stop advancing at that level. And The Empire Whacks Back is full of firmly tongue-in-cheek references to Star Wars. It is a very a lot. I don't like things that are intentionally wacky. I just, you know, things that are self-consciously trying to be funny, I often will bounce off of them because I just don't find the jokes that funny. For whatever reason, this just lands for me because it's still trying to tell an honest, like, it's not expecting you to be like nudging, you know, someone in the ribs and like, when you're running it. Like, there's an actual cool fucking story that's in there. It is clear what their references are to and clear what their jokes are referencing, but the story itself looks really good. And I saw a review on Drive-Thru RPG from someone who had posted a really shocking posting online that is snarky, but they posted a review of it saying effectively like, this is your first entry, is just a Star Wars riff. Well, good luck with that. And to that person, I'd say, who hurt you? Like, first off, if on its face you don't like the idea that there's Star Wars references, that's fine. That is perfectly fine. But to suggest that it was a mistake, or to not engage and see that there is way more to those Star Wars jokes than in the meat of the setting and the meat of the story that is absolutely appropriate to the setting, where it takes the joke but uses those as a way to elevate stuff from the unique setting of this. Boy, oh boy. I don't know, like, I hope you find joy in some of your games, because, like, geez, what a shitty thing to say about someone's product without clearly understanding what the product is about. Again, the setting is definitely not for everyone, but it has... One of the ways it gets around the issues with low-level play in 5th edition is that there is for one, there's a lot more to the stories than just, like, go to X and kill so-and-so. Like, they're much more story-focused. And there is a set of rules for basically brawls. So, like, bar brawls or tavern brawls or street brawls or whatever else. There's a whole set of mechanics that every character gets special, abilities for and whatnot that are just that kind of, like, beat 'em up stuff. And things can go bad, too. Also, the characters you're playing are wanted criminals. Whether you are guilty of those crimes or not is up for the player to decide, but every character is also a wanted criminal. So you're playing these, like, riff-raff on the outskirts, working together as mercenaries, trying to, just make enough money for a dry room with a roof over your head, hopefully some booze to get you through, the evening. It's just a really fun. If you ever saw... Well, we're talking about this with respect to Westerns being able to adopt any other kind of sensibilities. This is something that really steals the sensibilities from Westerns into a very unique fantasy setting. Again, it's not going to be a setting for everybody, but there's a quick start you can get for free that gives you a full sense of it. For myself, there's more than enough in the setting. There's a series of different nations in it that all kind of represent, like, kind of the rough Mediterranean area. Also, just so happens it looks like Italy. So there you go. Each of the settings has its own unique thing, and they run the gamut from kind of silly to very gothic horror-ish. There's one nation there that definitely has a horror vibe to it, surrounded by mist and so forth. It is magical. It's high fantasy. Just that your characters aren't going to be necessarily, transforming the world with wish or some other very high-powered magic. It just looks like it just looks like an enormous amount of fun. And I think that seeing these characters develop is the thing that could give it long-term life. And then there's also rules, I believe it's in this one, for retiring. Like, your characters don't need to keep adventuring. If they get stable, they can fade into the background, become NPCs, and another character comes up, another, hard Scrabble character. And because of those brawling mechanics, you don't feel like you're not watching the clock until you hit second level, the way that you are in default 5th edition, I think, because your characters are just, your bonuses are so crappy and whatnot. So I think it is a really unique game. Definitely not for everyone, not even everyone who plays in our player roster necessarily, but I think it fits my own sensibilities, and there are more than enough people I play with who would find it a similarly enjoyable thing. And there's lots of great stuff. To a long-term campaign with this would be just an enormous amount of fun, especially if you're playing a character who's trying to build, like if they are playing that kind of wrongly accused character, try to clear their name and, you know, return to, you know, honor or whatever, you know, your characters want to be. That is awesome stuff. Like that would be, that fits. And I mean, you can see how that also, why Star Wars is such a strong touch, like a strong influence on that first mega adventure. So yeah, so there's that. That for setting, suitability, sensibilities. Next one. We only have 4 more left, folks. So we're getting there. Next one is Cities Without Number. This is one of the many Kevin Crawford, you know, blank without number games that I have purchased and read, and I run this once as a pickup game on the channel, and there are aspects of that one session that made me think, maybe not right for our table necessarily, but it is the smallest of all of them, and it is the it's the one I think that got me the most excited once I started playing with the mechanics. And that's not to say that, like, I haven't Worlds Without Number I've not really done anything with. The couple of times I've run Stars Without Number, there's been some very exciting stuff that I've seen in it, and Godbound is something we're going to be playing in the new year. I've run that once before. It's a really awesome game. But this one, I think, so for cyberpunk games in general, the only other ones I've been exposed to have been Cyberpunk 2020 and more recently Cyberpunk Red and Shadowrun. And I love Shadowrun, and Shadowrun is not truly a cyberpunk game. Shadowrun is its own thing. There are some other games that have cyberpunk elements to them, like Dark Conspiracy, that I've run over the years, or I'm trying to think of it, or 2300 AD to a degree, but I have not run a truly cyberpunk setting. And for whatever reason, Cyberpunk, the game, Cyberpunk 2020, Cyberpunk Red, just didn't really click with me. And part of that is because it's just, there's a very deep lore to it, and I just don't care to, I don't want to do that homework. I don't want to have to learn the shit in order to start running a cyberpunk game. I'm sure the settings are amazing. I'm sure that there's a number of things that I would find really revelatory and would incorporate maybe into my own games too, but I just don't fucking care. I want to spend time reading about the different megacorps and whatnot, you know? But what is amazing with this is you don't have to. You can create everything from whole cloth for your campaign. You can make it the kind of cyberpunk that you want for that particular game. And even in the one session we played, it was so fucking cool seeing that world come together, you know, discussing what kind of things we're going to assume. You know, are there psychics in the setting? Is magic in the setting? Is there non-humans? Is there space travel? Whatever. Like all of his other games, it just gives us a cyberpunk. It gives you the opportunity to make a cyberpunk setting where you really can play up. And I understand that Cyberpunk Red, just to forestall any comments, I understand Cyberpunk Red does a good job of putting the punk in Cyberpunk, but this, I feel, lets you come to that conclusion in your own setting created by you while you're creating it. It also gives great structure for setting up missions and advancement and interesting options for characters. It's exceptionally deadly. That's really the only complaint I have about it, is it was really fucking deadly. And I think there's ways I could mitigate that with narrative metacurrency. But I think, and I mean, the appeal as well of having a book this small and the idea of taking this and running it for years with creations that only came from, you know, stuff that the game master or the players or both came up with and added to the setting, watching this unique setting created just for that campaign expand and change over time. That's awesome. And it gives you all the architecture you would need in order to do that. And I absolutely love that. And to give it its changing elements too. So the game, you can add, you know, it makes the world feel like it is changing and moving and developing. You're not standing still, which is a very cyberpunk thing. even in today's day and age, looking at the summaries of news articles and whatnot from 2023, I can't it boggles my mind that there's stuff that happened in January, February, and March that was actually this calendar year, you know? So you think of how fast the speed of information goes, and the pace of and this pace with which, you know, memory holding becomes a more pronounced thing, and how much more you need to inhabit the now. That is another thing that would be fascinating about running this kind of campaign, is incorporating that kind of like, how the fuck is this happening, you know, and then having that be a thing forgotten over time. Awesome stuff. So really could not say enough good things about what this would be or might be for it. Setting is what you want to make it. Suitability, Kevin Crawford has iterated for several games now how to make a game that will respond to advancement in terms of like letting them advance at a good pace, but giving you lots of time to develop a campaign over time, while also giving players lots of interesting options for their own characters. I'm not concerned about suitability for it. And as for sensibilities, as I said, those are the things I would want to see from Cyberpunk. I don't want to have to do homework for it. I want to, you know, add and make up and whatnot as much as I can from it, and this gives me everything I can, especially with those random elements that can be added. So for my own sensibilities, it's exactly what I would want out of a Cyberpunk game. Our third to last one, I talked about at length, but it has come up when we ran it 2 years ago, but it's come up recently for some folks talking about it, and that is Gary Gygax's second opus, I think, Mythos. So, for those who don't know, Dangerous Journeys Mythos is the first of what was planned to be a series of games written by Gary Gygax, the author, one of the authors of Dungeons and Dragons, and it was supposed to be his kind of next introduction to the world of kind of role-playing games. It is so a creature of its time, in the sense that he was terrified, quite rightfully so, of it being sued into non-existence by TSR, which it absolutely was. Without merit, I think that it's a bullshit claim, but at the time, TSR was the juggernaut, and Gary's publisher, Game Designers Workshop, almost went under because of this lawsuit. Dangerous Journeys is also a really, really fascinating insight into where Gary's mind was at the time he designed this. And people who, who are part of the old school Renaissance really love talking about like Gary's design sensibilities and like what Gary would want to do and what Gary's thoughts are, and what, as evidenced by some of the things he said late in his life and some of the products he worked on late in his life. But this to me is it's so interesting how different his mindset was at one point. From his telling of it, this was his go-to game for like a decade. And it's so different from Dungeons and Dragons in terms of how you think about your heroes, how you think about what the game entails, and what matters to make for a fun story. It is written in the same way that, the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide is, in the sense of it is extremely conversational. There are many digressions, and it is thick. This is, so the game itself is Mythos and Mythos Magic. There's a setting called Necropolis, and there's a streamlined version called, gosh, I can't remember, Mythos something or else. And there's a Game Master screen that has some stuff. There were a series of magazine articles that were released for it in the Journeys magazine that was very quickly put out of print when this game was sued out of existence. If you're interested in exploring Dangerous Journeys and Mythos Magic are the ways to go, because those are the ones that give the more interesting version of the game. Because it was created with the specter of the TSR lawsuit hanging over you, there's a lot of nomenclature in it that's very weird. So nothing is called what it's called in Dungeons and Dragons in Dangerous Journeys, to the point where like it yeah, it's a little belabored, and it proved to be impenetrable for some of our players to the point where they started renaming stuff to try and make it work. But I ran less than 10 sessions of this, and it's one of the most interesting games I've ever read. It is not one of the best games I've ever read, but it is, even just from a historical perspective, seeing what Gary was thinking when he designed this is just, it's such a rebuke that of the people who take the stance that Gygax would have one way of playing and this is only the way, you should be playing it his way. Absolute nonsense if you've read this and you've read his words. That may have been the case in the last years of his life, because whatever. But that's absolutely not where his mind is one. So, and setting aside from that, while it is there's a lot of barriers to engaging with this game in a meaningful way. Not the least of which that you can't get it digitally legally. It's also not in print anywhere. No one has picked up the rights to this. Whoever, I think it must be TSR, Wizards of the Coast, who owns this now, because they definitely got the rights as a result of a settlement at the end of the lawsuit. And I assume it was part of their corporate assets when it was acquired by Wizards of the Coast. But who the fuck knows where these rights are? I know the trademark has lapsed, so if you want to publish your version of Dangerous Journeys, fill your boots. But there is a really, really interesting idea for the game that's in here. There's skills that have all these interesting things that are nestled in there. So when I say that this game, the setting itself, the default setting is effectively an ersatz Earth. It has a lot of the problematic content you would expect from a writer of Gary's age, writing about non-Western cultures in that era. It carries over, I think, partly from ignorance about the different settings and places, and also some of the errors that come from the pulp era, where there's a tendency to exoticize or to just make up stuff about different cultures that you're not familiar with. And so that's a problem with the setting, but you can run a ersatz version of Earth that does not, there's plenty of great products that are out there that are inspired by different settings. So if you wanted to update that stuff to be more contemporary, there's plenty of great setting content you can get that is set in Asia, in Africa, in the Seventh Sea products in particular seem to have been prepared with a much more culturally sensitive approach taken to them, at least to the ones that were in print at the time of recording. So there's lots of great ideas you could draw from those things as well to supplement the setting. But the game itself and the magic system, it just has so many interesting things that I would love to see at play. Like the ongoing campaign of Dangerous Journeys would be not only exploring, the things you do in any other campaign, exploring the world, exploring your characters and your backstories and whatnot, it would also be exploring this game that has so many fascinating nooks and crannies in it and possibilities, half-baked ideas or overbaked ideas or whatnot that you could really draw on to make for a game that would not only be an exercise of exploration while you're learning about the characters and their adventures they've gone on, but also what this game is and what it could be. That, again, not for everybody, not by any means, but I think for my own sensibilities and for many of the players that I play with, and from comments on the channel on those Dangerous Journeys things, I think there's other folks too who would really enjoy that, because I think at the core there is a fascinating and really fun game here. And aside from all of that, it's also just a very, very interesting insight into a very specific time of game design with one of the more influential, one of the most influential members of the kind of, you know, the gaming pantheon, the folks who made the hobby what it is, you know, today that I get to enjoy so much. So that's my Dangerous Journey thing. Again, I got a link in the description. Unfortunately, not to any publisher or whatnot, just to Noble Knight. You can also find them on eBay, often for fairly cheap. Go into the game with minimized expectations. But I think that there is, I found, at least for myself, there was more than enough to really catch my interest. And yeah, man, you could have a really interesting long-term campaign with that. Suitability for advancement, I have absolutely no idea mechanically. That might be something you would have to adjust. The thing that is, you start with characters who are much more capable than your average first level character in any version of Dungeons and Dragons, excepting 4th edition. But I don't know, like, I have no idea. I think the advancement seems very moderate, more akin to what you get in like RuneQuest or Call of Cthulhu, where it's very modest by doing what you're doing. So anyway, our penultimate game, speaking of RuneQuest, is... Oh, hold on. Madison, you set up all these things, so you might as well use them. Let's take a quick sip here. Okay, there is Mythic Babylon, a setting published for the Mithras game that is published by Design Mechanism. Now, Design Mechanism has a bunch of different settings for them. Mithras, if you're not familiar, is effectively the version of 6th edition RuneQuest that they had worked on, the publishers had worked on for Mongoose. I think Mongoose published it. And the game is very similar to, in some ways, to what you get with RuneQuest Glorantha now, the one published by Chaosium, although it's divorced from Glorantha. And like, if you love Glorantha, and that's a big selling point for RuneQuest Glorantha, that's awesome. If you don't, or if you're just not wanting to put that much work, I like the barrier. I will be honest, the barrier for RuneQuest Glorantha for me is fucking Glorantha. I'm just not interested enough in reading about someone else's setting to have to do all that homework just to get it to the table. And I know that like, it's a brilliant setting, is incredibly realized. It's been added on by a bunch of other people. The setting and source books are gorgeous for it. And there's a lot of really fucking cool ideas that are in it as far as making characters members of the community and not just like, you know, sellswords or murder hobos. So I don't mean that to diminish it. It's my own failings as a game master. But I just like, I don't want to fucking read 200 pages of setting material and have to commit it to memory to run the damn game. And that's one thing that I like about Mithras, is it gives me the kind of mechanics without the actual, you know, work in the setting. And now that I've said that, Mythic Babylon, and the thing I find, it's a really hefty tome, 200, or was it 300 pages? Just over 300 pages long. It has some of the same sensibilities as Glorantha, and a game from a buddy of the channel, J.M. DeFogie, the author of Jackals, a fucking awesome Bronze Age role-playing game. Jackals is great for playing a fantasy Bronze Age setting, and it's a great set of rules, fascinating setting, really great game. And the publisher, the author, is also a terrific guy. This is playing an actual Babylon, and the thing that I find interesting about this is, again, similar to the reason I find the Caucasus region fascinating, is that I just don't think there's a lot known about Babylon, right? There is some broad generalities for it, and I mean this just in a general, and I don't mean to project my ignorance onto other folks. It's just that it's so rarely a location for any stories or any adventures in the RPG context. So, and it's a culture that existed for thousands of fucking years, you know, that shared a written language for however long, that shared, broadly speaking, a religion. So, like, longer than what modern Western, if you're thinking of modern from the nation state period, like tens, if not, dozens of times longer of a pedigree in this civilization. And that doesn't, I don't mean that as like a horse race kind of thing. I mean in the sense of like you can play characters who are part of a very, very old urban civilization with lots of sense of history and development and a sense of the past and of tradition and whatever else, and also of change and of dynamic new things. And that's not it. The dynamism of the modern age and the individualism of the modern age, obviously, it's not something that is customarily part of Babylon, but it's just it is a. There's a moment when I was getting close to getting this to the table, I was reading this, I was reading some other stuff, and I was listening to some other things, and I had a realization that went back to my childhood when one of the podcasts I was listening to about the history of Babylon, which includes the expulsion of the Jews, there is a hymn that they wrote while in exile in Babylon that talks about the rivers of Babylon, and the hymn is verbatim the lyrics to a Boney M song that I heard when I was a kid. And I love Boney M because the Rasputin song is one of my favorites of all time. Rasputin, but look, there's a bunch of songs from that band that my parents played when I was a kid, so I just have them burned in my fucking memory. And then as a younger guy, I went to the bar for their disco night, so we heard tons of Boney M there. And to hear that this modern day 70s disco pop song was a recreation of Babylon, of a song or a hymn written in the Babylonian era, the Mesopotamian era, it just mind-blowing. And the idea that modern timekeeping with this 12, base 12 kind of assumptions dates back to Babylonian numbering or Sumerian numbering. Again, another one of those ways where I just see the shadow of the past and the present in this fascinating and everyday way. And the thing they do in this game with the supplement, the reason this particular supplement appeals to me is because it gives you not only the mechanics that you would need to run something in Babylon or in the Babylonian setting, to a variety of different, like, high magic, low magic, whatever, and a variety of different types of approaches. It also gives you the information you need to make it a fun role-playing game. And that is what some historical stuff, when they get a little too enamored of trying to give you historical text, they lose track of the fact that, like, this is supposed to be a role-playing game. Like, how the fuck am I going to pick this up and run it? And this product does a fantastic job of showing you in a very, you don't need to read the whole thing. They can tell you, like, look, if you want to streamline getting us to the table, here's the stuff you need to look at, here's the stuff you need to consider, make these decisions, and then sit down and make your characters. And also, because so much of this is unknown and filling in gaps, you don't feel like you're going to tread on anachronisms quite as heavily. Setting aside the fact that, like I said before, it's a pretend story in a role-playing game anyway, so of course everything else is made up anyway, so who gives a shit if you get stuff wrong. But if you do want to try and capture as much of that setting, which I think is what appeals to historical role-playing games in the first place, this gives you that information you need in a very efficient and helpful way from folks who are not only extremely knowledgeable in the subject matter, but also they're game masters. They know what game masters need to do to get shit to the table. So it's a great, really, really great source book. I included a link to the publisher in the description of the video, but you can also get it in a PDF from Drive-Thru RPG. But it's just a really terrific source book, and it's all it's two-tone coloring in it. None of the pictures are in black and white, but just great stuff. Like I think if you had players who wanted to explore another one of those kind of hidden worlds that I talked about before, where it's just I don't think it's something people think about terribly often, and when they do, they think of it in that kind of like maybe biblical Old Testament kind of context. And I think that this setting gives you, the book gives you so many opportunities and so much information from making it a vibrant and breathing world, as much so as what any other historical setting could be. And the setting, because it's getting back to this whole RuneQuest thing, RuneQuest and what Glorantha does as well is you advance by doing things, by by using skills and whatnot. There isn't like necessarily, there are spells and whatnot you can learn if you're playing in that kind of setting, but it isn't, the advancement of characters comes down to what you do at the table and in the game. And I find that really interesting because, players don't need to think about like character building necessarily. I mean, they do to a degree, and like RuneQuest Glorantha, this Mithras, aka RuneQuest 6, also keys certain kinds of developments to you becoming enmeshed in the setting. No hero is an island in Mithras. If you want to advance in, learn greater secrets of magic or whatever, you need to become enmeshed in some kind of thing in the setting. So there is a way of the thing feeding back into the setting. And in a setting like Babylon, you can imagine how it would be cool if the players were running their own city-state, so with their own god or whatever. Not in a I don't know. I think it would be that might be an interesting thing to explore. So in any event, it's one of those settings where I find it as exotic and as interesting as any high fantasy setting that I've read. Part of that is due to the presentation in a very accessible way from a game perspective, but also because these people who wrote this, they really know their stuff, seemingly. So the last one, my last of the lucky 13, is Alien. And in particular, so this is a game that when I got it, it's gorgeous. And if you're familiar, it's published by Free League. It uses the Year One engine, similar to what a lot of their other games do, with different variations in the mechanics. This one is closest to The Walking Dead. And the thing I will say about Alien, before I ran it, it seemed interesting. Like I had run Vaesen before. I had run, what other Year Zero games had I run? I don't think I had run Forbidden Lands. I think I had run Twilight 2000 by that point, although that one is a little different because it's not dice pools, or at least it's a much smaller dice pool, only 2 dice. Alien uses a bunch of d6s, and then it has a differentiation between your like normal dice and your stress dice. And I have run Alien once, and it is one of the most evocative sessions I have ever run in any game. There are games that, especially licensed games, that try and capture whatever the source material is. And in some ways, it's making sure you've got, you can build heroes like you see in the source material, or to capture the experience of what those characters go through, or to make sure you've got all the different, things, like all the different superheroes or villains in a superhero game, or all the different species from a, Star Wars or sci-fi game. This one captured playing the game feeling like what I felt like when I viewed the media. When we played the game, there is a feeling of dread, but knowing dread, not as a character in the setting, but as a distanced viewer. When you're watching Alien or Aliens, from the get-go, even if you've never seen the film before, not everyone's going to make it out of this because, we're all media savvy. We've all watched movies and watched TV shows before and read books before, so you kind of know how fiction works. But that doesn't take away from when it's well executed as it is in those films, of ratcheting that tension up, of waiting for that sword of Damocles to fall on, whatever character you've got there. And the experience of playing this game and running this game is very much like that. It does a fantastic fucking job of capturing the visceral experience of playing through. All the adventures that they've published so far in the cinematic format, where you have pre-made characters and a pre-made plot, all the ones I've read are great. Really fucking great stuff. And it really suits the style of cinematic play that the game offers as one of the 2 ways you can play the game. The other way is in campaign play. And one of those is presented in the first source book that came out for it, which was the Colonial Marines handbook or source book. It's awesome. If you want to play a campaign that is more than just one of the Aliens films recreated, any number of them, take aliens, put them in certain, setting, watch until the end to see who lives, who dies. That's great stuff, and the game makes that process extremely enjoyable, and each of the adventures has more than enough twists and whatnot to make it really compelling. But the other way you can run the game is effectively as a sandbox. And I thought for a while, I'm like, having not gone into the setting, like, wow, like what would that be like? What wouldn't you just be waiting for the aliens to show up? And that is true to a degree. And there's lots of interesting ways that the source book, the game and the setting books that have come out for it give you a much bigger world to explain why this looming threat of aliens is more than just, LV-429 or whatever the name of the planet is. Alien also gives you the option for playing as colonists, or as people running a colony, or marshals, that are kind of troubleshooters on those things. The source book that just came out, or it's in, I can't remember if it's in print. I pre-ordered it, so it's out now, so I don't know if it's out for everyone. Building Better Worlds is the source book for colonization. And as much as I've said, I don't want to read your fucking setting before I start getting my world to the table, it turns out that this is a good reason why to do something like that, because the setting that they present, the sci-fi world that they're in with a rival interstellar, nations is not really the right word for it, but entities or political entities. Like, there's a reason there are colonial marines in the setting. Is because there are problems on the colony sometimes. And I think that there is a phenomenal campaign you could run, especially now that they've got this out, that gives you rules for players running colonies. That could be all the best parts of the underlying tensions in Aliens. And I don't mean the overt struggle of the aliens versus the humans. I mean the fucking lackeys against the corporate stooges, right? This is the Carter Burkes of the world and their, bosses. That's a theme that runs forward in a lot of these, in a lot of the subsequent material. But it's something they like the non-gaming material, but it's something they really touch on in this. So the idea of running a campaign that's like that, while also dealing with, because the reason that the aliens continue to be a threat in the setting is because of corporate fucking greed. The aliens themselves are almost a force of nature, and yeah, you want to see them and you want to face them, and that's terrifying and whatnot. But the reason all this shit is happening is because of Weyland-Yutani and their ilk. And that's, I think, the core of what could be, setting aside all the other kind of personal drama and other kind of stuff that would be fun that you could introduce. And there's some wonderful tables for generating random elements in both this and the core book and the Colonial Marine book. And you think of any kind of setting-based long-term fiction type stuff, so like Stagecoach, or what do you call it, Deep Space Nine or Babylon 5, any of those things where you're trying to do and build something. It's sort of like the reverse of what I've talked about on those long-term campaigns, on some of these other games. Instead of starting with your heroes going out and going on adventures, and then over time building a home and having investment in something, you're kind of starting on the reverse. You're at a place, you've got investment in it there, and then things start happening to you. And what do you do to respond to that? I don't necessarily mean that this could be a campaign that would run for 200 sessions, but who knows, right? I mean, I can think of, God, like first, I think it's Stagecoach or Bonanza. Bonanza ran for God knows however many years, and that's largely just shit coming to, to the people, to the what are they called? Not Clampets, that's the Beverly Hillbillies. Whoever the family was. There's lots of stuff you can do, and characters do not necessarily need to, you know, they don't need to die, you know, or conversely, they don't need to be the same characters. Characters could come in and out of the story as needed because of there isn't the same kind of like leveling up in this game as there is in some other RPGs. And even if you know, wanted to spend like, if you probably, I mean, you would not want to run an Aliens game where you don't see aliens, obviously, but there are ways of doing survival horror, if that's what is cool about Aliens. And arguably Aliens, the second one is military survival horror. Wow, like what better way of doing it than effectively having the outer space analogy of a cabin in a winter storm, perilous to get to, cut off from others, you know, with something going wrong there. There's definitely more ways to capture what makes Alien such a really fucking cool series without just always relying on the xenomorphs. And that's not to say you couldn't, because you could have the same place getting caught up in that. One of them there, you know, you could release on your, I don't know. There's all sorts of ways. I would leave it to the viewers at home, lest I run with this idea, to come up with their own ideas for how you might incorporate not only the aliens, but some of the other bizarre, you know, Prometheans technology that we see over the course of the entire set of Alien-style films that have influenced this role-playing game. I think that type of campaign, it would be a different pace to it than the other ones. It would be much more personal focused, but there's plenty of actual game to be dealt with there that I think would be really cool. And the shared resource of the colony that they introduce in this, I think is adapted from Forbidden Lands, and it's adapted from like the colony rules from the Walking Dead RPG, or maybe there was cross-pollination, I don't know. But in any event, I think it would make for a really fucking fascinating setting, even if it ended in tragedy. I think that still, you know, if it ended up like the colonists on LV-421 or whatever the, the number was, that would be a heck of a fucking story to play through. So yeah, so that's 13 games that I have looked at that I think would fit my settings, would provide good settings, suitabilities for long-term play, and sensibilities that would fit my own types of stories and games that I like to run. I think any of these would be suitable for a very long-term, not like, oh, I'm going to set this down as 10 sessions and we'll be done. An ongoing, undetermined length of time. Any of these would make for fantastic campaigns with the right table. I will see if there is anything in chat that are questions. I'll have a quick sip. I can hear my voice starting to go already. We have been going for 2.5 hours, so I guess that's not surprising. Hello to everybody in chat. Thank you so much for joining me there. If there are any comments that I don't get to, I will take a look at the chat afterwards and respond in comments if there is anything else that's on there. Okay, so this is a good one. Big 70 question was, how do you get motivated to run all these games? I sometimes struggle to get one game a week. I will tell you one big part of it is, I mean, a big part of it is circumstances. My son is fully grown, so I don't have little kids that I need to take care of. My job is such that I can be busy when I need to be busy, but I have free time when I need to have it. But the biggest fucking thing is reliable players. You know, game masters are nothing without players, and I have so many players who are reliable, who are willing to try new games, who are, you know, willing to roll with things when they're half prepared and just like let us see where things go with it. That is the thing that gives me I know I can get them to the table. I go through and consume more games now than I have at any other point in my life, and that is in large part due to because I know that if it's something that I think is cool, I'm going to be able to find someone who will want to play it and try it out. So that's a big part of the motivation is that when you know you got someone who wants to dive into it with you, that really makes it easier to put the work in and get the things to the table. I'm also like, I've always been like this, to be honest. It is a less helpful, thing. I'm always just kind of like this. It is also a little insufferable to be around sometimes. So it is as much of a fault as it is a credit. Thanks, Benny. My mom, my sweater. My mom knit me a sweater last year, and when I got this year's sweater, I found it. And I was like, oh fuck, I'm gonna wear this for the video. So thank you. Let's see here. Anybody else? Dangerous Journeys. That is awesome. Look, everyone. For those who are listening at, let's see. Hold on. Anything else? Yeah, okay, Ronaldo, yeah, with respect to the vampire stuff. So the thing with I'll just say about Vampire, both the Masquerade and Dark Ages in general, is that there is an ungodly amount of lore that has built up in that game and every other game that's been released under the World of Darkness kind of banner. The question was, or the comment was like how mind-boggling the kind of lore was with it. The thing that is awesome, I think of something that Mark Miller, the author of the Traveler role-playing game, said. Every version of the Third Imperium is going to be different. So whatever version of his setting that you have at your table is a unique one. And it does not matter if it differs from his vision of it. And in the same way, all the bloat and meta plot and whatnot that came out in the 90s and subsequently for all of those World of Darkness games, in particular for Vampire, you can cut all of that away. Not only for the modern day stuff, but also from, particularly for the olden day stuff, but even in the modern day stuff. You can just cut all of that away and only make the world... It's something that's nice about that, the Vampire setting, is that because... their vampires are not really the type to move around. They need a place to sleep safely at night. You pick a setting, a city, a town, a region, whatever the fuck you want, and then you build up who's important there. You build up what the relationships are, and then the players go into that, and as they start adventuring around, you're flushing in, because like if it's regardless of whatever setting, there's probably going to be a prince of the city, someone who is the big bad that runs the place. There's going to be rivals that prince will have. There will be agents they will have, like people who are the lawgivers and people who do the investigations and whatever. And that's set out in the source books. Fill those in with characters that you like, NPCs that you're familiar with, or steal them from existing stuff. And that's the world that's going to happen at your table. Whatever else goes on in that world, in the wider setting, if you choose to engage with that stuff and you choose to bring in some of that cool stuff, like whenever, I will tell you one type of game that I run where I go nuts with lore is comic stuff. I because of a lifetime of reading and obsessing over minutia of Marvel canon and DC canon and now Hellboy canon, I love drawing those little bits in for my own things, but that's because I love that stuff and because it pays off for me, not even always for players. You can choose what amongst that nonsense you choose to include in that game, and especially the 5th edition does a really good job of that in the way of they encourage you to use a graphic depiction of the relationships. So put the names of the player characters, have the relationships between them as lines, and then lines out to other NPCs. And that's how they suggest tracking what the world of your game is through those relationships as opposed to necessarily a geographic thing. What happens outside your city or outside the scope of your campaign, it doesn't matter unless you are bringing it into that world. So that would make it a little easier to engage some of the fun stuff from that, like it may have been in older versions as well, but one of the things I really love about the 5th edition rules for Vampire is they have a random encounter table for victims. And because in that version of the game, the sort of like medieval you know, medical understanding of different kind of like humors of like phlegmatic and choleric and sanguine. There's different types of like, you know, I don't know, what would you call it? Like power attuned blood aspects. It makes this fun, random thing. So if you want to make the feeding more than just a hand wavy kind of thing, there are some fun rules for that are in there. So that game very much encourages it more of a story sandbox rather than having to learn about an existing setting and then go in there. There are supplements like, you know, London by Night, London is Falling, or Fall of London, and Chicago by Night that give you those settings if you want that pre-existing, you know, architecture. But if you want to do it yourself, you're absolutely free to do so. So, I think that is, let's see here. Where do you find these reliable players and how do you reach out? So I will tell you, cell phone, one of the things is, and this is something that we talked about in our 200th session of the night below. As a game master, setting a time and keeping that time before I ever had a YouTube channel was a key part of having consistent play. You set the time, and if you don't have enough players to play whatever you had intended on playing, you play something else. So that time is never wasted. There's always games being played during that time, and especially if you're playing with folks who have a lot of stuff on their plate, that gives them the opportunity to reliably set aside that time, and they know they can take advantage of it. Things will change in people's lives, and they'll suddenly not be available at times they thought before, but keeping that time is I think the crucial thing to having the reliability, and that makes it easier for certain players to commit to that stuff and to make the arrangements in their life that are necessary to attend. So I mean, it's a bit of it's a lot of a crapshoot, and it's also sometimes recognizing when things aren't working right, or sometimes dealing with what you think is best. But I think being honest with your players as far as what your expectations are and what you're willing to give up, like to offer up to them, like a guarantee. If we set aside every second Friday to play, I will have something. We're either going to run that game that we had planned, or we'll have something else planned. Again, like for the game masters, that is sometimes shit comes up. I had in the last month a time, for the first time in the history of the channel, where I had to work on a Friday night. That I had something that needed to get done, and I just did not have time, so I had to cancel a session. But more often than not, I keep that because the game master is the one irreplaceable part of that. You can't run a game without a game master. You can run games without all the players. So that's one thing is that you can do that is within your realm of control. Otherwise, it's finding people who are looking for that, looking for that same kind of consistency. So, and sometimes also, I mean, that's a matter of a rotating game. There's folks on the channel who have regular groups where they rotate through games or rotate through game masters. And that is that's also something that sometimes is helpful. You can also, find local gaming stores often have gaming groups, and you kind of can not pick and choose, but you can try and find consistent folks who are of similar minds in terms of like setting the type of game you want to play, how often you want to play, how long you want to play that game for. That's a little trickier sometimes because it's often very rotating. Or there's a find a group channel on our Discord server, and like that hasn't necessarily always worked out for folks, but I know that there are games that are ongoing among some of the people who are part of our player roster now are folks who we started, other players played with them on that, and when we looked to expand out to add some folks to the player roster, that's how they recommended them. It was like, oh, these are great people to play with, so I say that only to say that there are some opportunities there as well, but it's really a matter of what is right for you. The people you like playing with who have the same expectations from a game that fit you. That's the thing that I have. Our player roster. Not everyone shares the same sensibilities in games. Not everyone enjoys the same settings or whatever else, but everyone has the same mindset as far as respect for time, respect for commitment, willingness to try new things. And that's the stuff that I think is key for keeping games going, right? But at the end of the day, without the game master having a rock solid, you know, consistency that players can then plan their stuff around, it's tough to have that. So not to put too much on the shoulders of the game master, but it is just one of the responsibilities. On the upside, you get to play with some pretty fucking awesome players. Let's see here. Now they have, oh, Tim, now they have name level characters in Night Below. Do you anticipate any setting down or domain building? Yeah, that's actually, you know, it's a great question, Tim, because we actually, one of the reasons why the switch to 5e has been so interesting has been that there are tons of third-party source books that give lots of fun supplemental material, including domain building and construct building. There's a book that just came out from Kickstarter, a preview version of Cubicle 7 released Uncharted Journeys, which is one of my favorite source books that I've ever purchased. I just love the book. It covers long-term journeys, so like traveling and whatnot. And what the new book called A Life Well Lived does is, in addition to providing some interesting rules for backstories for characters, and in basically an alternate way of generating background and stuff like that, it has really great rules for downtime, for campsite, fireside camping stuff, for mentors or patrons, for building a house, and for retirement. So that is really interesting to me. I love the mechanics in Uncharted Journeys, so I have I haven't got it to the table yet, but I have very high expectations for this thing. I like it enough that I already printed off a copy because I didn't want to wait and wanted to start using it. So once we are past, assuming our heroes survive, or at least most of them survive, their current task of retaking Broken Spire Keep, I do expect that, yeah, they're probably going to, we're going to see some, at the very least, it sounded like the players had some plans in mind for what they might want to be involved with reestablishing Broken Spire Keep as a stronghold. I mean, I don't want to speak for the players in this sense, and I mean, we've had some pretty, no spoilers, but we've had some pretty interesting developments in our last session. So I have to see what comes from that. And there are a lot of other threats and a lot of other things that are going to develop over the course of the campaign, but I don't know. I think one of the strengths of going to 5th edition now is that there are so many options for additional rules that can easily be subbed in, not just like grabbing monsters or things like that, but grabbing interesting rules. And that way of gamifying downtime and, you know, building a house or building a stronghold and whatnot, those rules appeal to me more. I have the Matt Colville ones as well, and I don't mind them, but they seem to be pretty heavily influenced by how Birthright did it, and I wasn't crazy about how Birthright did it. I need to read them in more detail, and there's probably some good ideas in it, and I love their monster book, but yeah, so the long and short of saying, like, yeah, I think there's a good chance of us seeing, now that the heroes are at the position, power level, and in the story where if they are successful in retaking Broken Spire Keep, it will be interesting to see what they choose to do with it. And with, you know, how that progression of time impacts all the other shit that's going on in that campaign. So, yeah, I agree, Ronaldo. Definitely having more than one GM is good. Let's see. I think that's it, folks. I think that is it. I will be, as I said at the outset, I will be doing a year in review on New Year's Day. I'll post more information about that and post a specific time for that. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this look through 13 different games that I think are really awesome, but I just don't have plans for getting to the table. If you do get them to the table yourself, I would love to hear how it went. That sometimes is enough to get me to bump these higher up on it. But man, it's truly a testament to what a golden age we live in as gamers and as game masters, to have so many amazing games, new and old, that we can draw on to, you know, to run our own games. So For those who joined me in chat today, for those who watched live, for those who are watching another time, thank you so much for joining me. There are the usual links to the Hero Save Villages charity campaign below and to the Noble Knight. There's also a link not only from Dangerous Journeys, but also Noble Knight in general down below, and there's the discount code there. There's also a link to every game's publisher. Whether that's on DriveThruRPG or, you know, buying print versions, in the description of this video. So if any of these seem cool to you and you want to check them out for yourself or learn more from the publishers, that's where you can find that information. Otherwise, I hope that everyone has had a wonderful holiday break. I look forward to being back at the table with y'all very soon. We have two really fun mini adventures that are coming up. We've got a Swords and Planet Starfinder game that's coming up over the weekend, as well as two Conan sessions playing the Mongoose Conan game. But otherwise, as is always the case, I hope that I've given you a few hours for you folks to take your mind off the troubles of our world or your doldrums over the interim between Christmas and New Year's, and to think of some of the amazing games and campaigns that could be had with some of the terrific games that we've talked about today. And until we see you again, stay safe, stay healthy, happy gaming, and happy holidays.